The waves hadn't changed, but everything else had. David Carter stood at the edge of a town he swore he'd never see again. A 6-year-old boy's hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers, and a letter in his jacket pocket he hadn't written yet. Somewhere behind the dunes, a woman who had every reason to hate him was waiting with the truth he'd spent years running from. If you've ever carried guilt that wasn't fully yours to carry, stay with me to the end. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I read every single one. David Carter had been awake since 4 in the morning, though the sun didn't bother showing up until almost 7. He sat in the driver's seat of a rental car that smelled like pine air freshener and somebody else's cigarettes, watching the gray Atlantic light creep over a town called Mill Haven like it was apologizing for something. In the back seat, his son Eli was still asleep, head tipped against the window, mouth open, one shoe off for no reason David could ever figure out. The kid lost shoes the way other people lost car keys. David hadn't planned on stopping the car this long. He'd told himself the whole drive down from Richmond that he'd get in, handle what needed handling, and get out before the town had a chance to recognize him. But here he was, parked across from a diner that used to serve the worst coffee in 3 counties, staring at a building that hadn't changed paint colors in 8 years, and he couldn't make his hands move toward the ignition. "Dad?" Eli's voice came out thick with sleep. "Are we there?" "We're there," David said. "Just sitting for a second." "Why?" "Because sometimes you need a second." Eli accepted this the way 6-year-olds accept most things adults say, without much interest, already moving on to the next question. "Can we get pancakes?" "Yeah, bud, we can get pancakes." The diner was called Sal's, and it was exactly as bad as David remembered, which was somehow comforting. The waitress who took their order had a name tag that said Donna and a face that suggested she'd been called worse than tired. She didn't recognize him, which was a relief, because David wasn't sure he had the energy to explain who he was or why he was back. Eli ate his pancakes with the focused intensity of a surgeon, and David picked at eggs he didn't want, his phone sitting face down on the table like it might bite him. He'd been putting off looking at it since the message came in 2 days ago. He already knew what it said. He'd read it 4 times before shoving the phone in his pocket and pretending he hadn't. It was from Victoria Hale. He hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in 6 years, not since the night everything fell apart in a kitchen that smelled like burnt garlic and unsaid things. Victoria was the mother of the woman David had once believed, with the kind of certainty young men mistake for wisdom he would spend the rest of his life with. Her name was Claire. David didn't let himself think it often. He'd trained himself out of it the way you train yourself out of touching a bruise, except some bruises don't actually heal. They just stop hurting if you're careful enough not to press on them. The message had been short. Victoria Hale wasn't a woman who wasted words, not in business, and apparently not in personal catastrophe either. "David, I know it's been a long time, and I know you have no reason to answer this, but I need to see you. There are things I should have given you a long time ago, and I'm not getting any younger about waiting for the right moment. Please come to the house. Tomorrow, if you can. V." He'd read somewhere that Victoria Hale ran one of the largest logistics and shipping conglomerates on the East Coast now that she sat on boards, that business magazines used words like formidable and uncompromising to describe her. None of that surprised David. What surprised him was the tone of the message. There was no command in it, no corporate polish. It read like something written by a person standing at the edge of a decision they'd been circling for years. "You okay?" Eli asked, syrup on his chin, watching his father with the unsettling perceptiveness kids have when you least want them to have it. "Yeah," David said. "Just thinking about a friend I used to have." "Is that why we drove so far?" "Something like that." After breakfast, David drove them to the small rental house he'd booked online, a single-story place 2 streets back from the water with a porch that sagged in the middle and curtains that smelled like someone else's detergent. He got Eli settled with a tablet and a bowl of crackers, told him not to leave the porch, and stood outside for a long moment with his phone in his hand before he finally called the number at the bottom of the message. Victoria picked up on the second ring. "David?" Just his name. No greeting, no pleasantries. Her voice was lower than he remembered, or maybe it had always been that low, and he'd just forgotten, the way you forget the specific weight of things you used to carry every day. "Victoria," he said, "I got your message." "I assumed you would. You were never the type to ignore something that scared you. You just took a long time to face it." David almost laughed. It wasn't funny, but it was so exactly like her that something in his chest loosened slightly. Is that an insult or a compliment? With me, it's rarely just one thing. A pause. Can you come today? This afternoon? I have my son with me. Bring him if you need to. Or don't, if you'd rather he not be there. I have a woman who comes by. Marisol, she's wonderful with children. She could watch him in the kitchen while we talk. David rubbed his eyes. He hadn't expected logistics. He didn't know what he'd expected. Anger, maybe. Some version of the ice that had existed between them the last time they spoke, the night Claire had stood in her mother's kitchen with red eyes and her arms crossed like a wall, and Victoria had looked at David like he was something she needed to remove from her daughter's life as efficiently as possible. 3:00, David said. I'll bring Eli. He's good. He won't be any trouble. I never thought he would be. Another pause, longer this time. Thank you for calling, David. I wasn't sure you would. She hung up before he could respond, which was very much like the Victoria he remembered. Always one step ahead, always closing the conversation on her own terms. David stood on the porch for a while after that, looking out at a strip of gray ocean visible between two houses, trying to figure out what he was walking into. He hadn't told anyone he was coming to Millhaven, not really. His sister Mara knew, because Mara always knew everything, but she'd just told him to be careful and to call her if it got to be too much. His ex-wife, Eli's mother, a separate and entirely different kind of complicated, didn't know because it wasn't her business anymore. Not since the divorce 2 years ago had quietly, almost gently, ended a marriage that had never quite caught fire to begin with. David had loved her the way you love a good friend you've decided to build a life with. It hadn't been enough in the end, for either of them, but at least they'd parted without the wreckage that usually came with these things. They shared custody. They were civil. Eli was happy, mostly, which was the only metric David really cared about anymore. But none of that. Not the marriage, not the divorce, not the years of rebuilding himself into someone who could function, had touched the place inside him that still belonged to Claire Hale. He'd loved her first, before he knew what love was supposed to cost, and some part of him had never fully come back from losing her. He'd left Millhaven 6 years ago believing, with the absolute conviction of a 26-year-old who didn't yet understand how complicated truth could be, that he was the one who'd ruined everything. He'd been distant that last year, buried in work, scared of a future he didn't think he deserved. He'd said things in the worst arguments that he still woke up cringing over. He remembered Claire crying in a parking lot outside a restaurant, asking him why he kept pulling away when she needed him close. And David hadn't had an answer, because the honest one, that he didn't think he was good enough to keep her, was too embarrassing to say out loud. So he'd left. Not just the relationship, the town, the job he'd had there, the friends they'd shared. He'd packed 2 duffel bags and driven north, and told himself it was for the best, that Claire deserved someone who wasn't so broken, and he'd built an entire identity afterward on the foundation of that guilt. He was the man who destroyed something good because he wasn't enough. It was a story he told himself so many times it had become indistinguishable from fact. He picked Eli up off the porch a little after 2, got him into a clean shirt, and drove toward the address Victoria had given him, a stretch of coastline north of town where the houses got bigger and the lawns got greener and the whole world seemed to exhale a little, like money made the air easier to breathe. The Hale house was exactly the kind of place David remembered, except more so. Gray shingles, white trim, a wraparound porch facing the ocean, the kind of understated wealth that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew. He'd been here before, years ago, for a 4th of July barbecue Claire had dragged him to, terrified the whole night that her mother would see straight through him and find him wanting. He hadn't been wrong to worry. Victoria had been polite that night, even warm in her clipped way, but David had felt her watching him like she was running calculations he couldn't see. He parked in the circular driveway, helped Eli out of his car seat, and stood for a second staring up at the house like it might change its mind about letting him in. The front door opened before he even reached it. Victoria Hale looked older than David remembered, but not in the way he expected. There was less armor in her face. She was still tall, still sharp around the shoulders, dressed simply in a cream sweater and dark pants, her gray-streaked hair pulled back, but her eyes, when they landed on him, didn't have the cool assessment he remembered. They looked tired, relieved, almost. David. She glanced down at Eli, who was clutching David's hand and staring up at the big house with frank 6-year-old curiosity. And this must be Eli. Claire told me about him a while back. She said you'd had a son. David hadn't expected that Claire still talked to her mother about him, even years later, even after everything. She did? We talk. Victoria's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. Come in, please. The inside of the house smelled like cedar and old books. A woman David hadn't met, Marisol presumably, appeared from somewhere near the kitchen and crouched down to Eli's level with an easy warmth that put the boy at immediate ease. There were cookies mentioned. There was a television with cartoons. Eli, who would befriend a houseplant if it showed him enough attention, went without complaint. Then it was just David and Victoria, standing in a wide living room with windows facing the water, the kind of silence between them that had 6 years of unspoken things crammed into it. Sit, Victoria said. Please. I made tea, though I suspect you'd rather have something stronger. Tea's fine. They sat across from each other in a room that felt too large for 2 people and too small for the conversation they were about to have. Victoria poured with steady hands, though David noticed she didn't quite meet his eyes while she did it. I imagine you're wondering why I asked you here, she said finally. The thought crossed my mind. I owe you an apology first, for the way I treated you the last time you were in this house. I was cold to you, and I let my daughter believe certain things about you that weren't entirely fair because it was easier than examining my own part in what happened. David set his cup down carefully. Victoria, you don't have to... I do, actually. Her voice sharpened, just slightly, the businesswoman underneath the grief showing through. I've had 6 years to think about this. I'm not going to waste the opportunity being polite about it. David said nothing. He'd learned, somewhere in his 30s, that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for someone was just let them talk. When you and Claire ended things, I told myself a very simple story, Victoria continued. You left. You were scared. You were emotionally unavailable. You couldn't commit. And you broke my daughter's heart on your way out the door. It was a comfortable story. It put the blame somewhere outside our family. It meant I didn't have to look too closely at the things Claire and I had done wrong, or the things I had taught her about love that maybe weren't healthy. What things? David asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Victoria looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face cracked open just slightly. Claire grew up watching her father and me communicate through silence and avoidance. We were married 31 years, and I don't think we ever once finished a hard conversation in our entire marriage. We'd start, and then one of us would shut down, and the other would get angrier, and eventually we'd just stop talking about it and pretend it had resolved itself. That's what Claire learned love looked like. Not talking, pulling away when it got hard. I imagine that sounds familiar. David felt something cold move through his chest. It did sound familiar. It sounded, in fact, exactly like the last year of his relationship with Claire, the way conversations would start with real feeling and end in silence, the way both of them would retreat to separate rooms of the same house and call it giving each other space. I always thought that was me, David said. I thought I was the one who couldn't show up. That's the story I've told myself for 6 years. It wasn't only you, Victoria said. That's what I need you to understand. That's why I asked you here. She stood, smoothing her pants, and gestured for him to follow her. There's something I need to show you. I should have shown you years ago, but I told myself it wasn't my place. I've since decided that was a coward's excuse. She led him down a hallway lined with family photographs. Claire as a child, gap-toothed and grinning. Claire in a graduation gown, a photo David hadn't seen before. Claire standing on a beach somewhere with her arms wrapped around her own shoulders, looking out at water, looking, David thought, lonely in a way that made his stomach hurt. At the end of the hallway was a door Victoria unlocked with a small brass key from her pocket. This was my husband's study, she said. After he passed, I didn't have the heart to change it. I use it now for things I'm not ready to throw away and not ready to look at. The room was small, lined with bookshelves, a single window looking out toward the water. In the corner sat a wooden chest, the kind with brass clasps that looked like it belonged in an antique shop, and beside it several cardboard boxes neatly labeled in handwriting David didn't recognize. "What is this?" he asked. Victoria knelt by the chest, undid the clasps, and lifted the lid. Inside, organized with a precision that David suspected came from grief rather than habit, were stacks of envelopes. Dozens of them. Maybe more than dozens. Some yellowed slightly with age, some looking newer, all of them sealed. All of them in the same handwriting David would have recognized anywhere, even after 6 years, even in his sleep. Claire's handwriting. "After you left," Victoria said quietly, "Claire wrote to you. Not emails. Letters. Real ones. With a pen, sitting at the kitchen table some nights until 2 in the morning. She wrote you everything she couldn't say to your face. Why she pulled away when you needed her to come closer. Why she let you believe you were the only one failing. What she was afraid of. What she regretted." Victoria looked up at him. Her eyes were wet now, though her voice stayed steady through sheer force of will. "She never sent them. She was too afraid, I think, that telling you the truth would mean admitting she'd had a part in losing you, and somewhere along the way she'd decided it was safer to let you carry all of it." David's legs felt unsteady. He lowered himself onto the small wooden chair beside the chest without quite meaning to. "Why are you giving these to me now?" he asked. "Why not years ago? Why not give them to her, let her decide?" "Because Claire doesn't know I kept them," Victoria said. "She gave them to me to throw away the year after you left. She couldn't stand having them in the house. I told her I would dispose of them. I lied. I couldn't burn the only honest things my daughter had written about her own heart, even if she wanted them gone." She paused. "And because I watched what carrying that guilt did to you, David, I have my sources. People talk. This town isn't as big as it thinks it is. I heard you left your job here within a month. I heard you didn't date anyone seriously for years. I heard the version of you that left Millhaven was not the same young man who walked into that 4th of July barbecue. I let that happen because it was easier than confronting what my daughter and I both knew and never said. I'm not interested in being comfortable anymore. I'm 61 years old and not getting any healthier, and I decided I didn't want to die having let an innocent man carry a guilt that was never fully his to carry." David stared down into the chest, at all those sealed envelopes, years of a woman's unspoken heart sitting in a box like evidence in a trial no one had ever held. "I don't know if I can read these," he said honestly. "You don't have to read them today," Victoria said. "You don't have to read them at all if you decide that's not what you need. But I wanted you to have the choice. I took that choice away from you once by staying silent. I won't do it twice." David reached out and lifted one envelope from near the top of the pile. The paper was soft with age, the ink slightly faded. On the front, in Claire's handwriting, just his name. David. Nothing else. No address, because it had never been meant to travel anywhere except into this box, into this darkness, waiting. "Can I take some time?" David asked, his voice rough. "I have Eli. I don't think I can do this with him down the hall." "Of course." Victoria stood, brushing her hands on her pants, composing herself the way David imagined she'd composed herself before 1,000 board meetings, except this one had cost her something none of those ever had. "Take the chest if you'd like. Take your time. There's no deadline on this, David. There never was. I just couldn't let it sit in the dark forever." They stood there for a moment, two people who'd once regarded each other as obstacles, now bound together by a box of unsent grief. "Thank you," David said finally, "for telling me, for not letting it just disappear." "Don't thank me yet," Victoria said, something almost like a sad smile crossing her face. "You haven't read them. I don't know what's in all of them, not really. I never let myself read more than the first lines of a few before I couldn't bear it. They might not give you peace, David. They might just give you a fuller, messier truth. Sometimes that's worse before it's better." David thought of the years he'd spent believing a simple story about himself. The man who ruined a good thing, who wasn't built right for love, who left because leaving was the only honest thing he knew how to do. He thought about Eli down the hall, about the divorce, about all the ways he'd built his whole adult life around a wound he'd never properly let anyone look at. "I'd rather have a messier truth," he said, "than a clean lie I've been living inside for 6 years. Victoria nodded slowly, like that was the answer she'd been hoping for, and together they carried the chest out to David's car, while Eli, oblivious and sticky with cookie crumbs, waved goodbye to Marisol like they were old friends. David buckled his son into his car seat, loaded the chest into the trunk like it weighed considerably more than its actual size suggested, and stood for one more moment in the Hale driveway, looking back at the house, at the woman standing in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself against the ocean wind. "Victoria," he called out. She paused. "Does Claire know you're doing this?" A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of waves somewhere behind the house, patient and indifferent to everything human beings did to each other. "Not yet," Victoria said, "but I imagine she will, eventually. Some truths have a way of finding their way home, David, whether we send them or not." David drove back toward the rental house with the ocean on his left and a box of his ex-girlfriend's unsent heartbreak in his trunk, Eli humming some tuneless song in the back seat, completely unaware that his father's entire understanding of himself was about to be taken apart, letter by letter, in the days that followed. He didn't know yet what he would find in those envelopes. He didn't know that some of what Claire had written would break something open in him he'd kept carefully sealed for 6 years. He didn't know that understanding, when it finally came, would hurt in a different way than guilt ever had. Quieter, sadder, but somehow survivable in a way the guilt never was. All he knew, pulling into the driveway of the little rental house with the sagging porch, was that he wasn't the same man who had driven into Millhaven that morning, and the chest sitting in his trunk, full of a truth 6 years too late, was only the beginning. Eli fell asleep within 10 minutes of the car moving, the way he always did, like someone had flipped a switch behind his eyes. David carried him inside, still buckled into the weight of sleep, laid him down on the bed in the smaller of the 2 bedrooms, and stood there a moment longer than necessary just watching his son breathe. There was something about a sleeping child that made the rest of the world's noise quiet down, even if only for a minute. David needed that minute. He needed several of them. He went back out to the car for the chest. It was heavier than it looked, or maybe it just felt that way because of what was inside it, the way grief has a strange physics that makes paper weigh more than it should. He carried it through the front door and set it down in the middle of the living room floor, then stood over it with his hands on his hips like it might do something unexpected if he looked away. He didn't open it right away. He made coffee he didn't drink. He checked on Eli twice. He sat on the porch for 15 minutes watching the neighbor's cat stalk something invisible in the grass. He realized eventually, stalling the way he used to stall before difficult conversations with Claire, circling the thing instead of walking into it, telling himself he was being careful when really he was just being afraid. "Okay," he said out loud to no one. "Okay." He sat down on the floor in front of the chest, the way he used to sit on the floor of Claire's apartment back when they were 25 and broke and happy in a way he hadn't fully appreciated until it was gone, and he opened the lid. The envelopes were arranged in no particular order that he could tell, just stacked the way grief stacks things, urgently, without much thought for organization, because organizing implies you plan to look at it again someday. He picked up the one closest to the top. "David," the front read, nothing else. He turned it over. The seal was still intact, 6 years old, the glue gone slightly brittle. He broke it open. The letter was dated about 3 weeks after he'd left Millhaven. Claire's handwriting was smaller than he remembered, tighter, like she'd been trying to fit more truth into less space. "David, I keep starting this letter and then stopping because every time I write something honest, I get scared and tear the page up. This is my 4th try. I'm not tearing this one up. I don't care how bad it sounds. I told my mother you left because you were scared of commitment. That's not entirely true. You were scared, yes, but I don't think it was commitment you were scared of. I think you were scared of being seen, really seen, the way I was starting to see you, tired, unsure, not as put together as you wanted me to think you were. And instead of telling you that I saw all of that and loved you anyway, I got quiet. I let you think my silence meant disappointment. It didn't. It meant I didn't know how to say, I see you struggling and I'm not going anywhere, without sounding like I was managing you, like you were a problem I was trying to fix instead of a person I loved. I'm sorry I let you believe my silence was judgment. It was actually just fear, wearing a different coat." David put the letter down on his knee and sat very still. He remembered that period she was talking about, the months before the end, when he'd been working 60-hour weeks trying to prove something to himself, coming home late, snapping at small things, apologizing badly, and Claire had gotten quieter and quieter until her quiet felt like a held breath he couldn't release no matter what he did. He'd interpreted that silence exactly the way she'd predicted he would. He thought, she's pulling away because she's realizing what I actually am. He had never once considered that her silence might have been fear instead of judgment. He had simply absorbed it as confirmation of everything he already believed about himself. He opened a second letter. This one was dated almost 2 months after the first, the handwriting looser, more urgent. David, I had a dream last night that you came back and I didn't know what to say to you. I woke up and just lay there for an hour feeling like an idiot because you're not coming back. I made sure of that, didn't I? I told you to go. I remember the exact words. Maybe it's better this way. I said that. I said it because I was furious and hurt, and I wanted to hurt you back a little, and I knew exactly which words would do it. I don't think I meant it. I think I meant, I'm so scared of how much I need you, and I don't know what to do with that fear except push you away before you can leave me first. That's not a sentence you say out loud at 25. At least I didn't know how to. David set that letter down too. His hands weren't quite steady. He thought about that night, the one she was describing, a fight in the kitchen of the apartment they'd shared for 2 years, both of them exhausted from months of slow erosion, both of them saying things designed less to communicate and more to wound. He remembered Claire's face when she said, maybe it's better this way. The flatness of it, like she'd already decided, like there was no version of the conversation that ended differently. He had taken that flatness as proof. He had packed a bag within the week. He hadn't known, how could he have known, that the flatness was a mask, that underneath it was the same fear he'd been carrying, just dressed differently, performing differently, but rooted in the exact same place. Two people, equally terrified, speaking 2 different dialects of the same panic, each one certain the other had already left first in their heart. He kept reading. There were letters about small things, a song that came on the radio that made her cry in a parking lot, a mutual friend's wedding she didn't attend because she couldn't stand the questions about David, a stretch of 3 days where she didn't get out of bed except to go to work and back. There were letters about big things, her therapist, the one she finally started seeing 8 months after he left, telling her that she had a pattern of testing people by pushing them away to see if they'd fight to stay, and that David had simply done what everyone in her life had always done when tested that way. He'd left. Not because he didn't love her enough, because nobody had ever taught either of them how to stay through that kind of test. David read 12 letters that first night, sitting on the living room floor of a rental house 2 streets from the ocean, his phone forgotten, his coffee gone cold, his son asleep down the hall, completely unaware that his father was slowly being taken apart and put back together by paper and ink. Around midnight, he stopped. Not because he wanted to, but because his eyes had started blurring and his chest had developed a tightness that felt dangerously close to something he didn't want to deal with alone in an unfamiliar living room at midnight. He put the letters back, carefully, the way you'd handle something that might shatter, and sat with his back against the couch for a long time, staring at nothing. He didn't sleep well. He kept hearing fragments of Claire's sentences in his head, rearranging themselves, colliding with his own memories until he could no longer be entirely sure which version of events was real, the one he'd carried for 6 years, or the one slowly emerging from a wooden chest full of things she'd never meant for him to see. Eli woke him up the next morning by climbing onto his chest and asking, with the particular gravity of a 6-year-old who has decided something is very important, whether they could go see the ocean today. Yeah, David said, his voice rough with sleep and the residue of too much feeling. Yeah, we can go see the ocean. They spent the morning on the beach. Eli collected shells with the seriousness of a man assembling a museum collection, narrating each find in a running commentary David only half listened to, his mind circling back again and again to the letters waiting for him at the house. He watched his son chase a wave out and then run from it, shrieking with delight as it chased him back. And David thought about the version of himself that had walked into Millhaven a day ago, believing one simple story about why he was the man who couldn't keep love. He wasn't sure that man existed anymore. He wasn't sure who had replaced him yet, either. His phone rang around noon. Victoria. I wasn't going to call, she said, when he picked up. I told myself I'd give you space. I'm calling anyway. I'm 61, David. I've earned the right to be a little impatient. David laughed despite himself, sitting on a beach towel while Eli dug a hole nearby with grim determination. I read some of them last night. How many is some? 12. Victoria was quiet for a second. How are you? Honestly, I don't know yet. It's like finding out a movie you've watched 50 times had an entirely different ending that nobody told you about. He rubbed his eyes. I always thought I was the only one who broke it. I built a lot of my life around that idea, that I was the problem, that I left because something was wrong with me that made me incapable of staying. And now? Now I'm not sure anymore. It's not better, exactly. It's just different, heavier in a different place. I know that feeling, Victoria said. I lived inside it for 31 years with my husband, and another 6 watching what it did to my daughter and to you, even from a distance. I'm not going to pretend the truth is comfortable, David. I just believe it's better than the alternative. Why didn't Claire ever send them? David asked. It was the question that had been sitting underneath everything since the night before. If she felt all of that, if she wrote all of that down, why keep it locked away? Victoria sighed, and David could hear the weight of years in it. Because admitting fault out loud to the person you hurt, that requires a kind of bravery most people don't have access to, especially not at 25, especially not when they're also hurting. It's easier to let someone believe they're the villain. It lets you stay the victim. I'm not saying that to be cruel about my daughter, David. I did the exact same thing with her father for 31 years. We are not, as a family, very good at this particular kind of honesty. I'm trying to be better at it now, in whatever years I have left. David watched Eli stack wet sand into something that might have been intended as a castle, might have been intended as nothing at all, just the pure physical joy of building something only to watch the tide eventually take it back. Does she know I'm here? David asked. In Millhaven? Not for me, Victoria said. But this town has a memory, David. Someone will have seen you at Sal's by now. Someone will mention it to someone who knows her. I'd be lying if I said I thought you had much time before word reached her, one way or another. What happens if she finds out before I'm ready? I don't know, Victoria admitted. I genuinely don't know how she'll react to any of this. I've thought about telling her myself for months, and every time I get close, I lose my nerve. That's its own kind of cowardice, I suppose. I gave the letters to you before I gave her the truth about keeping them. Maybe that's backward. I've made a lot of decisions in my life by instinct, and I'm fairly sure I've made some of them wrong. I just know that you deserve to see your own story clearly, whatever happens next. After they hung up, David sat on the beach for a long time, Eli's small voice narrating an elaborate sandcastle drama in the background, and thought about Claire, not the version of her he'd built in his memory, frozen at 25 and furious in a kitchen, but a fuller, messier version. A woman who'd grown up in a house where love was something people performed instead of practiced. A woman who tested the people she loved by pushing them, because somewhere along the way she'd learned that real love was supposed to survive being tested, and anything that left when pushed clearly hadn't been real in the first place. David had failed that test all those years ago, not because he didn't love her enough, but because nobody had ever told him the test existed or how to pass it. He went home that afternoon and read 7 more letters. The 4th day in Millhaven, David ran into someone from his old life. He was at the hardware store picking up a few things for the rental house, a light bulb, batteries, something to fix the screen door that kept sticking, when a familiar voice said his name from behind a display of paint cans. David Carter. I'll be damned. He turned to find Tom Ridley, who'd worked construction with him the summer before everything fell apart, now a little heavier, a little grayer, wearing a contractor's vest with a company logo David didn't recognize. Tom. David shook his hand, genuinely glad to see him, surprised by how glad. It's been a while. 6 years, man. You disappeared off the face of the earth. Heard you went up north. Tom looked him over, the way old friends do, cataloging the changes. You look tired, brother. Long story, David said. You got time for coffee? I close up the truck in 20 minutes. David thought about Eli, asleep in the rental house with a sitter he'd found through the local listing Victoria had recommended. A retired school teacher named Joan, who had immediately won Eli's loyalty with a deck of cards and an endless supply of patience. He had time. They sat at a coffee shop 2 doors down, and Tom, who had never been a man who tiptoed around things, got straight to it. So what brought you back? Last I heard, you swore up and down you'd never set foot in this town again. David turned his cup in his hands. Victoria Hale called me. Tom's eyebrows went up. Claire's mother? That's a name I haven't heard attached to you in a long time. She had some things of Claire's from after I left. Letters Claire wrote but never sent. David paused. Turns out the story I'd been telling myself about why everything fell apart wasn't exactly accurate. Tom leaned back in his chair, studying him. You always did blame yourself for that breakup. I remember. You worked yourself half to death that last year trying to prove you were good enough to keep her, and somehow that just made everything worse. Yeah, David said quietly. Apparently it made it worse for both of us, just in different ways. You ever talked to Claire since you left? David shook his head. Not once. Not a call, not a text. Nothing. I figured that was the kindest thing I could do, get all the way out of her life so she could move on properly. Turns out I might have just left her holding everything by herself. Tom was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee absently. She's still here, in town. Didn't go far. Took over part of the family business eventually, the shipping side, works with her mother now. Never married? He said it carefully, watching David's face when he did. David felt something tighten in his chest that he didn't examine too closely. How is she? Genuinely. Good, I think. Successful. Busy. Keeps to herself more than she used to. Tom hesitated. She doesn't talk about you, if that's what you're asking. At least not around me. But Sarah, you remember Sarah, my wife. Sarah ran into her at the grocery store a couple years back and said Claire looked sad in a way she couldn't quite explain. Said it like it surprised her, given how well everything looked from the outside. David didn't say anything for a while. The coffee shop hummed around them, ordinary life continuing in a way that felt almost offensive given the size of what was unfolding in David's chest. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of this, David admitted finally. I came here to settle something with myself. I wasn't expecting to find out the thing I was settling wasn't even true. What are you going to do? Look her up? I don't know yet, David said honestly. I've got a kid back at the house who needs me more than my own past does right now. I think I need to finish reading what's in that box before I decide anything else. Tom nodded slowly, like that made sense to him, and changed the subject to easier things. His kids, his business, the absurd price of lumber these days. And David let himself be carried along by the ordinariness of it for a while, grateful for the break. But that night, after Eli was asleep, David sat with the chest again, and he found himself reaching for the letters with a different kind of urgency than before. Knowing Claire was still in town, still close, still real and present rather than some frozen memory from 6 years ago, made every word in those envelopes hit differently. These weren't just artifacts of a dead relationship anymore. They were pieces of a woman who existed right now, possibly miles away, unaware that her unsent confessions were currently unraveling someone she might still think about on nights she didn't talk about to anyone. He read a letter dated almost a year after he'd left. David, I saw your sister at the farmer's market today. Mara. She didn't see me, or maybe she did and was kind enough to pretend she didn't. I almost went up to her. I wanted to ask if you were okay, wherever you are. I didn't, obviously. What would I even say? Hi, I'm the woman who told your brother it was better this way and then spent the next year regretting every word of that sentence. I think about you constantly, which feels unfair to admit since I'm the one who sent you away. But I don't know how else to say it. I miss the version of us before everything got complicated. I miss being 23 and stupid about it, before we both got so scared of losing each other that we ended up losing each other anyway, just slower and uglier than it needed to be. I hope you're happy, David. I hope wherever you are, you're not carrying around the same guilt I gave you that night in the kitchen. I think about that more than almost anything else, that I let you walk out thinking it was all on you. I should have run after you. I didn't. I told myself it was pride. I think it was actually just fear, the same fear, dressed up one more time. David put the letter down and pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. He thought about all the nights since he'd left Millhaven, the apartment he'd rented in Richmond that he'd never quite made feel like home, the relationships he'd started and quietly sabotaged before they could get serious, the way he'd thrown himself into his marriage with Eli's mother determined to prove he could be steady, reliable, present, only to discover that he'd built that marriage on the foundation of trying to outrun a guilt rather than actually loving someone for who they were. He thought about how often, lying awake at 3 in the morning, he'd replayed that final fight with Claire and concluded, every single time, the same verdict. You weren't enough, and you knew it, and you left before she could find out for herself. He had never once considered that Claire might have spent those same sleepless nights replaying the same fight and arriving at her own verdict. I tested him because I was terrified, and he failed because nobody ever taught him the test existed, and it's my fault as much as his. 2 people. Same wound, different sides of it. Both convinced they alone carried the blame. By the end of the first week, David had read almost half the letters. He started keeping a small notebook beside him as he read. Not to record anything specific, just because writing things down had always helped him process, even as a kid. He found himself writing fragments. Not my fault alone. Not her fault alone. 2 scared people who didn't know how to ask for what they needed. He wrote, I left because I believed leaving was honest. She stayed silent because she believed silence was safe. Neither of us was right. Neither of us was a villain. Eli, blessedly unaware of the seismic shift happening in his father's understanding of himself, spent his days building an increasingly elaborate relationship with the ocean, collecting an alarming number of shells, and asking Joan the babysitter so many questions about how tides worked that she eventually printed out a children's diagram from the library just to keep up. One evening, after Eli had gone to bed, David called his sister Mara. You sound different, she said almost immediately, before he'd said more than hello. Different how? I don't know. Lighter and heavier at the same time. What's going on down there? David told her about Victoria, about the letters, about the slow dismantling of the story he'd lived inside for 6 years. Mara listened without interrupting, which was rare for her, and when he finished, there was a long pause on the line. I always hated that story you told yourself, she said finally. The one where you were the villain. I used to want to shake you. You were 25, David. You were scared and overworked, and nobody taught either of you how to fight fair. That doesn't make you a monster. It makes you human. I know that now. Sort of. I'm still figuring out how to actually believe it, instead of just understanding it intellectually. That's normal. Believing things in your chest takes longer than believing them in your head. Mara was quiet for a second. Are you going to see her, Claire? David looked toward the window, toward the dark shape of the ocean, somewhere beyond the houses, invisible at this hour, except for the sound of it. I don't know, he admitted. Part of me wants to. Part of me thinks showing up after 6 years with a box of her own secrets might be the worst possible thing I could do to her. She didn't choose to have these read. Her mother made that choice for her. That's true, Mara said. But you also didn't choose to spend 6 years thinking you destroyed something good all by yourself. Maybe at some point the kindest thing isn't protecting her from an uncomfortable conversation. Maybe it's just being honest, the way neither of you knew how to be back then. David didn't have an answer for that yet. He told Mara he loved her, promised to call again soon, and sat alone in the quiet living room for a long time after they hung up. The chest open beside him, more letters waiting, more of Claire's unguarded heart spread out across years he hadn't known about, each one chipping away at the simple, punishing story he'd built his whole adult identity on top of. He picked up another envelope. This one was dated almost 3 years after he'd left, recent enough that the ink looked barely faded at all. David, I don't even know why I'm still writing these. Maybe because some part of me needs somewhere to put all of this that doesn't involve actually facing it. My therapist says I have a pattern of doing that. Keeping feelings in boxes instead of rooms, she says, where at least they'd have to breathe a little. I told her that was a strange way to put it. She told me to write you a letter about it. So here I am. I think I finally understand what happened between us. I don't think you left because you stopped loving me. I think you left because I made loving you feel like a test you were destined to fail, and you got tired of failing it. I wish I could go back and tell 23-year-old me that real love isn't supposed to be a test at all. I wish someone had told me that before I learned it the hard way, by losing the person I loved most in this world over a lesson I didn't even know I was teaching. I hope, wherever you are, you found someone who doesn't need you to pass any tests. You deserved that a long time ago. David sat with that letter in his lap for a long time, the house quiet around him, his son asleep down the hall, the ocean somewhere out there in the dark, patient and endless, carrying its own secrets in and out with every tide. He thought about Victoria's words from that first afternoon. They might not give you peace, they might just give you a fuller, messier truth, and understood, finally, exactly what she'd meant. The guilt wasn't gone, but it had changed shape. It no longer sat in his chest like a verdict. It sat there now like a question, one he wasn't sure yet how to answer, but one that no longer felt like it belonged to him alone. He closed the letter carefully, set it back with the others, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, fell asleep without the familiar, exhausting weight of believing he was the only one who'd broken something beautiful. David woke up the next morning with the letter still on his mind, the way a song gets stuck behind your eyes instead of your ears. Eli wanted waffles. David made waffles, badly, burning the first two before he got the iron's timing right, and Eli ate them anyway, with the forgiving appetite of a child who didn't yet understand that food could be judged. "You're quiet today," Eli said, syrup dripping off his fork in a way that suggested gravity was about to become David's problem. "Are you sad about your friend again?" David caught the syrup with a napkin before it hit the table. "A little. But it's a good kind of sad, I think. Does that make sense?" Eli considered this with the seriousness he gave most things. Like when a movie ends and it's sad, but you're glad you watched it. Exactly like that, bud. He took Eli to the small public library in town that afternoon, mostly because Joan wasn't available, and partly because he needed somewhere that wasn't the rental house, somewhere the chest of letters couldn't follow him with its quiet gravitational pull. Eli disappeared into the children's section with the focus of a man on a mission, and David sat near the window with a paperback he wasn't really reading, watching the parking lot, his mind elsewhere. That was where Victoria found him. He didn't see her come in. He only looked up because Eli, returning with an armful of books about sharks, stopped dead and stared at the tall woman standing a few feet away with an expression of polite, careful neutrality. "David," Victoria said, "Joan mentioned you might be here. I hope it's all right that I came." "Of course." David stood, surprised, glancing at Eli, who was now studying Victoria with the open curiosity of a child trying to figure out where an adult fit into his world. "Eli, this is Victoria. She's a friend." "Hi," Eli said. "I found a book about hammerhead sharks. Did you know their eyes are on the sides of their heads so they can see almost all the way around?" "I did not know that," Victoria said, and something in her face softened in a way David hadn't seen yet, not even in the quiet moments at the house. "That sounds like a very useful book. Maybe you could teach me about it sometime." Eli, satisfied with this answer, wandered back toward the shark section, apparently to find more material to teach with, and Victoria sat down across from David at the small library table, folding her hands in front of her. "I won't keep you," she said. "I just wanted to tell you something in person, rather than over the phone." David's stomach tightened. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, exactly." Victoria glanced toward the children's section, where Eli's voice was rising in an animated, one-sided conversation with a librarian about shark anatomy. "Claire is coming to the house tomorrow, for dinner. It's something we do most Sundays, has been for years, just the two of us." David felt his pulse pick up. "Are you telling me to stay away?" "I'm telling you it's happening," Victoria said carefully, "and that I think you have a decision to make, sooner rather than later, about whether you want her to find out about the letters from you, or from circumstance, or not at all. I won't tell her unless you ask me to. But I think you should know the clock you've been operating on just got considerably shorter." David ran a hand through his hair, glancing toward Eli, who had now recruited the librarian into what appeared to be a full presentation on shark dental structure. "I haven't finished reading them all." "You don't need to finish them to decide what you want to do," Victoria said. "I'm not pushing you toward her, David. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not trying to engineer a reunion. I'm a 61-year-old woman who made the mistake of staying silent for far too long, and I'm simply trying not to repeat that mistake by keeping you in the dark about her schedule. What you do with that information is entirely yours to decide." "Does she know I'm in town?" Victoria hesitated, which told David everything before she even spoke. "I believe she does, yes. Millhaven isn't large, and you've been seen. At Sal's, at the hardware store, on the beach with your son. I haven't told her myself, but I'd be surprised if no one has mentioned it to her by now." David sat back in his chair, feeling the floor shift slightly beneath a decision he hadn't realized he was going to have to make this soon. He'd pictured vaguely some future version of himself who had finished the letters, processed everything, arrived at some kind of peace, and only then decided whether to seek Claire out. He hadn't pictured running out the clock before he was ready. "I need to think," he said. "That's fair," Victoria said, standing, smoothing her coat. "Take the time you need. I just didn't want you to be blindsided." She paused, glancing once more toward Eli, who had moved on to a different librarian entirely and was now, David suspected, explaining the digestive system of a shark with considerable enthusiasm. "He's a wonderful boy, David. You've done well with him." "Thank you," David said, and meant it more than the simple words conveyed. After Victoria left, David sat at the library table for a long time, the unread paperback forgotten in front of him, his mind turning over the new information like a stone he couldn't quite get a grip on. Claire was here, in this town, 15 minutes away, possibly already aware that he was back. Tomorrow, she would walk into her mother's house for a Sunday dinner she'd had 100 times before, with no idea that her own unsent heart was sitting in a wooden chest in a rental house 2 streets from the ocean, slowly rewriting another man's understanding of everything. He collected Eli, who insisted on checking out 4 books about marine life, and drove home with his son narrating shark facts from the back seat, while David's mind raced through scenarios he had no good answer for. That night, after Eli was asleep, David didn't reach for the letters right away. Instead, he sat on the porch with a beer he didn't really want, staring at the dark shapes of houses across the street, trying to articulate to himself what he actually wanted to happen next. Did he want to see Claire? The honest answer, the one he'd been avoiding since Victoria's message first arrived, was yes. Not in some dramatic, sweeping movie moment way. He wasn't 25 anymore, wasn't operating on the kind of certainty that made grand gestures feel possible. But there was something underneath the guilt, something that had survived 6 years of him trying to bury it under work and marriage and divorce and fatherhood, and it had stirred awake the moment he opened that first envelope. He wanted to see her. He wanted to know if the woman in those letters, scared, honest, regretful, still existed somewhere inside the successful, composed person Tom had described. The one who'd taken over part of the family business and never remarried and looked, according to someone's wife at a grocery store, sad in a way nobody could quite explain. But wanting to see her and knowing what to do with that want were 2 very different problems. He went back inside eventually and pulled out his notebook, the one he'd started jotting fragments into as he read the letters, and wrote slowly the way you write something you're trying to convince yourself of. This isn't about getting her back. This is about understanding what actually happened so I can stop carrying something that was never only mine to carry. Whatever I decide to do about Claire has to come after that, not instead of it. He read 4 more letters that night, working his way deeper into the chest, into years he hadn't known about, watching Claire's voice change on the page as time passed, angrier in some places, more resigned in others, occasionally almost light, as if she'd had a good day and let herself write about something other than him for a paragraph before circling back, inevitably, to the same wound. One letter, dated almost 4 years after he'd left, stopped him cold. "David, Mom mentioned today, very casually, like she didn't think it would matter to me, that you got married. I don't know her name. I didn't ask. I went to the bathroom and threw up, which felt dramatic even as I was doing it, and then I came back to dinner and finished my plate and talked about a shipping contract like nothing had happened because that's what we do in this family. We finished the meal. I want to be happy for you. I think some part of me is. You deserve someone who shows up for you the way I didn't always know how to. I just didn't expect it to feel like this. Like a door closing on a room I didn't realize I was still standing in. I hope she's good to you. I hope you're better at letting her in than you were with me. I hope, selfishly, that some tiny part of you still thinks about the apartment with the broken radiator and the summer we drove to the coast with no plan and got lost on purpose because neither of us wanted the day to end. I think about that more than I should. I'm not writing to you to ask anything. I just needed somewhere to put this. You know where these letters go. Nowhere. That's the whole point of them." David put the letter down and sat with his head in his hands for a long moment. He remembered that summer trip vividly, the wrong turn that became the right decision, the diner they found at midnight that served pie until 2 a.m, the way Claire had fallen asleep against his shoulder somewhere past the state line with her hand still tangled in his. He hadn't known, all those years later, that she'd thrown up over the news of his marriage. He hadn't known any of this had cost her anything at all. He'd built an entire story where he was the only casualty, where Claire had simply moved past him cleanly while he limped along carrying the wreckage alone. The letters made it very clear that wasn't true. It had never been true. He sat with that for a long time before he finally went to bed, and even then sleep didn't come easily. He kept hearing her voice in his head, the version of it on the page, scared and honest in a way the actual Claire, composed, successful, according to everyone he'd talked to, apparently never let herself be out loud anymore. Sunday morning, David made a decision he wasn't entirely sure was the right one. He called Victoria. "I want to come to dinner tonight," he said before she could say hello properly. "Not to ambush her. I'll leave the second she wants me to. But I think I need to see her, Victoria, before I read another word of those letters. I think continuing to learn everything about her from paper without ever looking her in the eye is its own kind of cowardice. The same kind I've apparently been running from for 6 years." There was a long pause on the line. "Are you certain?" "No," David admitted. "But I don't think certainty is something I'm going to get by waiting longer." "I'll need to tell her you might be there," Victoria said. "I won't spring you on her, David. That wouldn't be fair to either of you. Let me call her this afternoon, give her the choice of whether to come at all, knowing you might be there. And if she says no, then you respect that," Victoria said simply. "Some doors don't get to be opened just because you're finally ready to knock on them. She gets a say in this too." David accepted that, even though it sat uneasily in his chest, a reminder that whatever he was feeling, whatever clarity the letters were giving him, none of it entitled him to anything from Claire. She'd built a life in the 6 years he'd been gone. She was allowed to want that life left undisturbed. Victoria called back 2 hours later. Her voice sounded careful, measured in a way that told David she was choosing her words with deliberate precision. "She said yes," Victoria said. "She also said, and I'm quoting her directly because I think you should know exactly what you're walking into, 'I don't know if I'm ready for this, but I'm tired of not being ready for things.'" David closed his eyes. "That sounds like her." "It does," Victoria agreed, something almost like warmth in her voice. "Dinner's at 6. Bring Eli if you'd like, or arrange for Joan, whichever feels right to you. I'll leave that to your judgment." David arranged for Joan. Some conversations, he understood, weren't meant to happen with a 6-year-old present, no matter how good that 6-year-old was at reading rooms. He spent the afternoon in a state he didn't have a good word for. Not quite anxious, not quite hopeful. Something jittery and unresolved sitting in his chest that made it hard to focus on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. He changed his shirt twice. He told himself that was ridiculous, that this wasn't a date, that he was a 32-year-old divorced father walking into a complicated, painful conversation, not a teenager going to prom. He changed his shirt a third time anyway. He arrived at the Hale house a few minutes before 6, his stomach in a knot that hadn't loosened the entire drive over. Victoria opened the door before he knocked, her face doing something complicated. Relief, maybe, or the particular tension of a person who has set something in motion and is no longer entirely sure she can control where it goes. "She's not here yet," Victoria said. "Come in. I thought it might help to have a few minutes to compose yourself before she arrives." David stepped into the house he'd been in only days before, though it felt like much longer, like an entirely different version of his life had walked through this door the first time. Victoria led him to the same living room, the window still facing the same gray stretch of ocean, and poured him a glass of wine he didn't ask for but accepted gratefully. "I want to say something before she gets here," Victoria said, sitting across from him, her posture straight in the way David imagined it had been, straight through 1,000 difficult board meetings. "Whatever happens tonight, however this conversation goes, I want you to know that giving you those letters was not a mistake. I've turned it over in my mind every day since you walked into that study, wondering if I'd done something unforgivable by opening a door my daughter had deliberately closed. But watching you these past several days, David, watching the weight come off you slowly, letter by letter, I believe I did the right thing. Even if tonight is hard, even if Claire is angry with me for a while, I believe it was right." "Thank you," David said quietly, "for trusting me with it." They heard the car in the driveway a few minutes later. David's heart did something complicated and immediate, a lurch he hadn't felt in years, Not with this particular intensity, not since the early days with Claire, when just the sound of her key in a lock used to make his whole chest light up. He stood without quite meaning to, smoothing his shirt, and Victoria gave him a brief steadying look before going to the door. He heard them before he saw them, Victoria's voice, low and warm, and then Claire's, a sound David hadn't heard in 6 years, a sound that hit something in him so immediate and physical it nearly knocked the breath out of him. "Mom, you said he might be here. You didn't say he'd already be—" And then she was in the doorway of the living room, and David was looking at her for the first time in 6 years. She looked different and exactly the same, both at once, the way people do when enough time has passed to change them without erasing the person underneath. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, cut to her shoulders, and she was dressed the way David imagined she dressed for work, sharp, composed, a blazer that suggested she'd come straight from somewhere important. But her eyes, when they landed on him, lost every bit of that composure in an instant, and for a moment she just stood there, frozen in the doorway, looking at him like he was something she'd convinced herself she'd imagined. "David," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the single syllable. "Hi, Claire." It was all he could manage, his own voice unsteady, in a way that embarrassed him. Nobody moved for a long moment. Victoria, standing slightly behind her daughter, looked between the two of them with an expression David couldn't quite read. Something between hope and dread. The look of a woman watching a decision she'd made finally come due. "I need a minute," Claire said finally, not quite looking at either of them, and turned and walked back out toward the porch. David looked at Victoria, unsure what to do. "Give her a moment," Victoria said quietly. "She'll come back. She's not someone who runs from things, even when she wants to. She just needs to find her footing first." David waited, his hands sweating, his heart pounding in a way that felt almost violent. Through the window, he could see Claire standing at the porch railing, her back to the house, her shoulders rigid, one hand pressed against her mouth like she was holding something in. It was almost 10 minutes before she came back inside. Her eyes were red but dry, her composure rebuilt, though David could see the effort it had taken to put it back together. "Mom," she said, "can you give us a minute? Just David and me?" Victoria nodded and left the room without a word, closing the door to the kitchen gently behind her. And then it was just the two of them, standing in a living room with 6 years of unspoken things between them, the ocean visible through the windows, patient and indifferent, the way it had been through every version of this story. "Why are you here?" Claire asked. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't warm either. It was careful, the voice of someone protecting something. "Your mother contacted me," David said. "She had something she needed to give me." "What?" David hesitated, and in that hesitation, Claire's eyes sharpened, reading something in his face she clearly didn't like. "What did she give you, David?" "The letters," he said finally, because there was no version of this conversation that worked if he started it with a lie. "The ones you wrote after I left. She kept them. She never threw them away like you asked her to." Claire went very still. For a moment, David thought she might walk straight out of the house, and he braced for it, understanding suddenly and completely how much of an invasion this might feel like to her. Her most private, unguarded thoughts, handed to the one person they were never meant to reach, without her consent, without warning. "She had no right," Claire said, her voice low and shaking now. "Those were private. I wrote those for myself, not for—" She stopped, pressing her hand against her forehead. "How many did you read?" "Most of them," David admitted. "Not all. I've been working through them for a week." "A week?" Claire laughed, a short, disbelieving sound with no humor in it. "You've been here a week, reading my—" She stopped again, turning away from him, her arms wrapped around herself the way David had seen her in that photograph in the hallway, the one of her alone on a beach, looking lonely in a way that made his chest ache. "Claire," he said gently, "I'm not here to use them against you. I'm not here because I think they change something I'm owed. I'm here because for 6 years I believed I was the only reason we fell apart. I built my whole life around that. And your letters—" His voice caught, and he had to stop, swallow, start again. "Your letters told me a different story. One where it wasn't just me. One where we were both scared, both hurting, both saying the wrong things because we didn't know how to say the right ones." Claire turned back to face him, and David saw, for the first time since she'd walked into the room, the version of her from the letters, unguarded, raw, the careful business composure cracked open just enough to let something real through. "You think reading my private pain made things even between us?" she asked, but the anger in it had softened into something more like exhaustion. "David, I spent years writing those because I couldn't say any of it to your face. The idea of you reading them without me there to explain, to give context, to—" She shook her head. "It feels like you walked into a room in my house I never invited you into." "You're right," David said, "and I'm sorry. I should have asked your mother to wait, to let me come to you first, to give you the chance to decide whether you even wanted me to know any of it. I didn't think about that until it was already happening. I was so deep in my own guilt, I didn't fully consider what it would feel like for you, having that guilt taken out of my hands without your permission." Claire studied him for a long moment, her arms still crossed, something working behind her eyes. "Why did you leave, David? Really? Not the version you've decided is true. Not the version I've decided is true. What actually happened? From where you were standing?" David took a breath. This was, he realized, the conversation he should have had 6 years ago in a kitchen that smelled like burnt garlic, before either of them had the chance to build 6 years of separate, incomplete stories about the same broken thing. "I left because I believed I wasn't enough for you," he said slowly. "Not because you said that. Not directly. But every time you got quiet, every time you pulled back, I read it as confirmation of something I already suspected about myself. That I was going to fail you eventually, the way I'd failed at things before. And I thought leaving first was kinder than making you watch it happen slowly. I thought I was being honest by leaving. I think now I was just scared, and leaving felt like the only thing I knew how to do with that fear." Claire's eyes were wet now, though she didn't let the tears fall. "I pulled back because I was terrified of how much I needed you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Every time things got good between us, some part of me panicked and started looking for the exit, because I'd learned, growing up in this house, that the people who needed each other too much eventually drowned each other instead. I tested you without even realizing I was doing it. I made loving me feel impossible to get right, and then I was angry at you for not getting it right." The two of them stood there finally, 6 years too late, saying the things that should have been said in that kitchen, in that final fight, before everything came apart instead of being rebuilt. "I'm sorry," David said, "for leaving the way I did, for not fighting harder, for letting you carry the story that you drove me away, when really, we didn't know how to hold on to each other the right way. Neither of us did." Claire wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so unguarded, so unlike the composed woman who'd walked through the door 20 minutes earlier, that David felt something in his chest crack open completely. "I'm sorry too," she said, "for everything I didn't say, for letting you believe it was all your fault, because admitting my part felt too dangerous at the time." She paused, looking at him with an expression David couldn't quite name. Grief, maybe, or relief, or some complicated mixture of both. "I don't know what to do with this, David. 6 years of one story, and now it's just gone, replaced by something messier." "I know," David said. "I've been sitting with that same mess for a week. I don't have an answer for what we do next. I'm not even sure there's supposed to be a next. I just couldn't keep carrying a story that wasn't entirely true. And I didn't think it was right to keep carrying it without at least telling you that I knew, now that it was never just me." Claire looked at him for a long moment, the ocean light fading outside the windows, the kitchen door still closed where Victoria waited on the other side of it, giving them whatever time they needed. "I need to think," Claire said finally, echoing, without realizing it, the exact words David had said to her mother days earlier. "This is a lot, David. Finding out you're back. Finding out you read things I never meant for anyone to see. Finding out that the story I've told myself for 6 years might not be the whole truth either. I can't process all of that standing in my mother's living room in 20 minutes. Take whatever time you need," David said. "I'm not going to push. I needed you to know. That's all. I needed you to know it wasn't just you and it wasn't just me. It was both of us, two people who loved each other and didn't know how to do it without breaking something." Claire nodded slowly, and for a moment something passed between them that wasn't quite resolution, wasn't quite peace, but was at least the beginning of something honest. The first honest moment either of them had managed to have about the wreckage of their relationship in 6 long years. "I should go," she said. "I'm not ready for dinner. Tell my mother I'll call her tomorrow." "Okay," David said. She turned toward the door, then stopped, her hand on the frame, and looked back at him one more time. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for telling me the truth, even though it would have been easier not to, even though I'm still angry about how I found out." She paused. Maybe especially because it would have been easier not to. And then she was gone, the front door closing softly behind her, her car pulling out of the driveway a moment later, leaving David standing alone in the living room with the weight of 6 years, finally, painfully, beginning to lift, even as a new and different kind of uncertainty settled into its place. David didn't sleep much that night. He lay in the unfamiliar bed of the rental house listening to the ocean somewhere beyond the walls, replaying every word of the conversation with Claire, turning it over the way you turn over a stone looking for the side that makes sense. He kept landing on her face in that last moment before she left. The wet eyes, the careful gratitude, the door closing softly instead of slamming, which somehow felt like it meant something, though he couldn't have said exactly what. Eli woke him at 7, climbing onto the bed with the particular weightless enthusiasm of a child who'd slept 9 hours and felt fantastic about it. "You look tired," Eli said, which seemed to be becoming a theme. "Didn't sleep great, bud. Joan said we could feed the ducks at the pond today, if it's not raining." David looked out the window at a sky that couldn't decide what it wanted to do, gray clouds moving fast against patches of pale blue. "I think the ducks can wait. How about you and me, just us, today? We could do whatever you want." Eli considered this proposition with the gravity of a man being offered significant new responsibility. "Can we build the biggest sandcastle in the world?" "We can try," David said. "I make no promises about world records." They spent the morning on the beach, and David found himself grateful for the project, grateful for a task that required nothing of him except hauling buckets of wet sand and following his son's increasingly ambitious architectural instructions. Eli wanted towers. He wanted a moat. He wanted, at one point, what he described as a really big wall so the water doesn't get mad and knock it down, which struck David, despite himself, as a fairly accurate description of what he'd spent the last 6 years trying to do with his own life. "Dad, you're not listening," Eli said, exasperated, pointing at a lopsided turret that had collapsed twice already. "You have to pack it tighter, or it falls." "Ooh, you have to pack it tighter, or it falls," David repeated slowly, looking at the sand crumbling between his fingers. "That's pretty good advice, bud." "It's just sand, Dad. It's not advice." David laughed. The first real laugh he could remember having since he'd arrived in Millhaven and ruffled his son's hair, and for an hour or two he let himself just be a father on a beach, with a kid who didn't know anything about letters or guilt or ex-girlfriends with sad eyes, and it felt like the first clean breath he'd taken in days. His phone buzzed around noon. Not Victoria, Claire. He stared at the name on the screen for a long moment before answering, his heart doing the same complicated lurch it had done the night before. "Hi," he said. "Hi." There was a pause, the sound of wind on her end, like she was outside somewhere. "I didn't sleep much." "Me neither." "I keep thinking about what you said, about both of us not knowing how to hold on to each other right." Her voice was steadier than it had been the night before, but there was something underneath it, careful and uncertain. "I've spent 6 years assuming you just stopped loving me. That's a different story than the one you told me. It's going to take me a minute to live inside the new one." "I understand," David said. "I'm not asking you to live inside it overnight. I'm not even sure what I'm asking, honestly." "Can we talk?" Claire said. "Not at my mother's house. Somewhere just the two of us, where I'm not standing in a doorway with my mother in the kitchen listening through the wall." She wasn't listening through the wall, David said, though he wasn't entirely certain that was true. "She absolutely was," Claire said, and David heard for the first time something close to a laugh in her voice, small and tired, but real. "She's incapable of not knowing things, David. It's a professional condition at this point." "Yeah," David admitted. "I noticed." They agreed to meet that evening at a small place on the pier, a seafood shack that had been there since before either of them were born, the kind of place that survived on tourists in summer and locals year-round, with picnic tables outside facing the water. David arranged for Joan again, feeling guilty about how much he was leaning on her goodwill, and promised himself he'd find some way to properly thank her before he left town, whenever that turned out to be. Claire was already at a table when David arrived, sitting with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee, watching the water. She'd changed out of the blazer from the night before, into jeans and a soft gray sweater that made her look younger, less like the composed executive Tom had described, and more like the girl David remembered from a decade ago, the one who used to fall asleep against his shoulder on long drives. "Hey," he said, sitting down across from her. "Hey." She studied him for a moment. "You look better than last night. Less like you were about to throw up." "I felt like I was about to throw up." "I noticed." They sat in a silence that wasn't entirely comfortable, but wasn't hostile either, the kind of silence two people share when they both have a great deal to say and no idea which piece to pick up first. The ocean moved beyond the railing, the same gray water from David's memory, indifferent to the 6 years that had passed since the last time it watched the two of them sit somewhere together. "I read some of them again last night," Claire said finally, "after you left. I went home and I found copies. I'd kept drafts of some, the early ones, before I started just writing straight to the final version. I hadn't looked at them in years." She wrapped her hands tighter around the coffee cup. "It's strange reading your own handwriting from someone else's grief. I barely recognized the person who wrote some of those." "I felt that too," David said, "reading them. Like I was finding out about a version of you I never got to actually know, because you never let me see her." "I didn't let myself see her most days," Claire said. "It's easier to be the person who has it together. I learned that from my mother. Took me a long time to understand it wasn't actually a strength." David thought of Victoria, 61 years old, finally deciding to stop being comfortable, and wondered how much of this entire unraveling traced back to one woman deciding, late in life, that honesty was worth more than control. "Can I ask you something?" David said. "And you don't have to answer if it's too much." "Okay." "Why didn't you ever try to find me in 6 years, not even once?" Claire was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the water, her jaw working slightly the way it always had when she was deciding whether to say something true or something easy. "Because I was scared of what I'd find," she said finally. "I told myself it was respect. That you'd left, you clearly wanted distance, and I owed you that. But honestly, David, I think I was scared that if I reached out and you'd moved on completely, happily, without any of the wreckage I was still carrying, it would confirm the thing I was most afraid of. That I'd loved you more than you'd loved me. That losing you had cost me more than it cost you." She glanced at him. "And then I heard you'd gotten married, and I told myself, well, there's your answer. He's fine. He's better than fine. Move on." "I wasn't fine," David said quietly. "I got married because I was trying to prove to myself I could build something stable, something that wouldn't fall apart the way we did. It wasn't really about her. I think some part of her knew that the whole time, even before I did. We were divorced within 3 years, amicably, mostly, but it wasn't built on anything real. It was built on me trying to outrun what happened with you." Claire's eyes flickered with something, surprise maybe, or a complicated kind of vindication she didn't seem entirely comfortable feeling. "I didn't know that. About the divorce? Not many people here would. I didn't exactly keep in touch with Millhaven." "You have a son, though," Claire said, her voice softening. "Eli. He's beautiful. Smart, too, from what little I overheard yesterday about hammerhead sharks." David smiled despite himself. "He's the best thing I've ever done. Genuinely. Whatever else fell apart, he didn't. I made sure of that." "That matters," Claire said, and meant it. David could tell. The businesswoman's edge gone entirely from her voice now, replaced by something gentler. "You're a good father. I can tell just from the way you talk about him." They ordered food they barely touched, the conversation moving in fits and starts, circling old memories neither of them had let themselves revisit in years. The apartment with the broken radiator, the wrong turn that became the best night of that whole summer, A Christmas they'd spent arguing about whose family to visit first and ending up, ridiculously, just staying home together and ordering Chinese food, calling it the best holiday either of them ever had. I forgot how easy it used to be, Claire said at one point, watching the water. Before everything got complicated. Talking to you, I mean. It used to just be easy. It's still kind of easy, David said. Right now, this conversation. It's the hardest easy conversation I've ever had. Claire laughed, surprised into it. That's an accurate description. The sun was starting to drop toward the water by the time the conversation slowed into something quieter, more careful. David could feel the weight of what hadn't been said yet sitting between them, the actual question neither of them had asked outright. What now? What happens after two people spend an evening discovering that the wound they'd both carried separately for 6 years had always belonged to both of them? I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this, Claire said finally, echoing words she'd said the night before. Though her voice carried something different now, less defensive, more genuinely lost. I built a whole life around the idea that I drove you away by being too much, too needy, too scared. I structured everything around not letting that happen again. I don't date much, David. I haven't in years. I told myself it was because work kept me busy, and that's partly true, but it's also because some part of me decided a long time ago that getting close to someone meant eventually losing them, so why bother starting? David's chest tightened, hearing that, recognizing in her words an almost exact mirror of the armor he'd built around himself after the divorce. The careful distance, the unwillingness to let anyone get close enough to confirm what he already suspected about his own capacity to ruin good things. I did the same thing, he admitted. Different shape, same wall. I dated a little after the divorce, but I never let it go anywhere. The second things started feeling real, I'd find some reason to pull back. I told myself I was being responsible, that I had Eli to think about, that I didn't want to bring someone unstable into his life. But honestly, Claire, I think I was just protecting myself from finding out I'd fail again, the way I believed I'd failed with you. They sat with that for a while. Two people who had spent 6 years building separate, nearly identical fortresses out of the same broken thing, neither of them aware the other one was doing exactly the same. I'm not saying any of this to make a case for something, David said carefully. I want to be really clear about that. I'm not here trying to win you back, Claire. I came to Millhaven to put something to rest, and your mother gave me a truth I didn't expect, and that truth led me here to this table, tonight. But I'm not assuming that truth means we're supposed to pick up where we left off. That would be its own kind of unfair, rushing towards something just because the old guilt finally cracked open. Claire studied him for a long moment, something working behind her eyes. I appreciate you saying that, she said, because I don't know what I want yet, David. Honestly. 2 days ago, I thought I had my whole life figured out, sad in places, but stable, manageable. Now I don't know what's stable and what isn't. I need time. Real time, not performative time where I say I need space and then call you in 3 days because I can't help myself. Take whatever you need, David said. I mean that. I'm not going anywhere. Well, I am. Eventually, I have a son and a life back in Richmond I have to get back to. But emotionally, I'm not going to push you toward anything you're not ready for. Claire nodded slowly, and something in her shoulders relaxed slightly, like she'd been bracing for a different kind of conversation, one with more pressure in it, and was relieved to find this one didn't carry that weight. Can I ask you something now? She said. Of course. What changed for you? Reading the letters, I mean. What's different in you now than the man who walked into my mother's house a week ago? David thought about that question seriously before answering, turning it over the way Eli turned over shells on the beach, looking for the right angle to understand it from. I used to think guilt was the price I had to keep paying for leaving, he said finally. Like if I stopped feeling bad about it, I was somehow getting away with something. The letters didn't erase what I did wrong. I still left. I still didn't fight hard enough. I still let you believe my silence was confirmation instead of explaining what was actually going on in my head. But they showed me I wasn't the only architect of what fell apart. And once I understood that, the guilt stopped feeling like punishment I deserved and started feeling like something I could actually set down. Not forget, just set down. There's a difference. Claire was quiet, watching him, her eyes bright in the fading light. That's the most honest thing I think I've ever heard you say, she said softly. Even when we were together, You were never very good at saying things like that out loud. I'm working on it, David said. 6 years and a box of letters will do that to a person. They didn't resolve anything that night, not in any clean, definable way. There was no declaration, no kiss, no movie moment closing of the 6-year gap between them. They simply talked for nearly 3 hours about everything that had happened in the years they'd missed of each other's lives. Claire's work, the family business she'd grown into running alongside her mother, the strange grief of watching her father decline and pass 2 years earlier, something David hadn't even known about until she mentioned it almost in passing, her voice carefully controlled around the edges of it. "I'm sorry," David said, "about your father. I didn't know." "It's okay. It was hard, but it was also, I don't know, it made some things clearer watching him go. He and my mother spent 31 years not really talking to each other, not about anything that mattered. Right before he died, he told her he was sorry. For all of it. The silence, the distance, all of it. She told me about it afterward, crying, saying she wished he'd said it 30 years earlier instead of in a hospital bed with 2 weeks left." Claire looked out at the water. "I think that's part of why she gave you the letters, David. I think watching my parents waste 31 years not saying the true thing scared her into not wanting to watch us do the same." David thought about Victoria's words from that first afternoon. "I'm 61 years old and not getting any healthier," and understood now the full weight behind them, the specific grief that had pushed a careful, controlled woman into finally doing something reckless and honest. "I owe her a lot," David said, "more than I think I can properly thank her for." "She'll deny needing thanks," Claire said, almost smiling. "And then she'll secretly be thrilled you offered it. That's very much her." By the time they left the pier, the sky had gone fully dark, stars showing faintly through scattered clouds, the ocean a black expanse beyond the railing. Its sound the only constant thing in a night that had rearranged something fundamental in both of them. "I should get back to Eli," David said, standing beside his car. "Joan's been incredibly patient, but I don't want to push it." "Of course." Claire stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. "Thank you for tonight, David, for being honest, even the parts that were hard to hear." "Thank you for showing up," David said. "I wasn't sure you would, after how you found out about everything." "I almost didn't," Claire admitted. "I sat in my car outside this place for 10 minutes before I came in. But then I thought about my father, in that hospital bed, finally saying the true thing 2 weeks before it was too late to matter, and I thought, I don't want to be the person who waits that long. So I came in." David didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, something thick in his throat. "I'll call you," Claire said. "Not tomorrow. I need some real time, like I said, but I'll call you before you leave town, if you're still planning to." "I'd like that," David said. She got into her car and drove off, taillights disappearing down the coastal road, and David stood there for a long moment in the parking lot, the ocean breathing somewhere behind him, before he finally got in his own car and drove back to pick up his son. The next several days passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. David finished the remaining letters in the chest, working through them slowly now, no longer racing towards some understanding he didn't yet have, but simply sitting with each one, letting Claire's voice from those years settle into him properly. The last letter in the box was dated only 8 months earlier, recent enough that David realized, with a jolt, she'd still been writing them right up until Victoria had presumably retrieved the chest from wherever it had been stored, in preparation for this exact reckoning. "David, I don't know why I'm still doing this. Maybe it's habit. Maybe some part of me needs to believe that somewhere out there, even if you never read it, there's a version of the truth that exists outside my own head. I'm 31 now. I run half the company. I have a life that, from the outside, probably looks complete. I'm not sure it is. I think about you sometimes when I'm driving home late from the office, the same road we used to take to the coast that summer. I wonder if you ever drive roads that remind you of me. I wonder if you've forgiven yourself for whatever you've decided you did wrong, because I never properly forgave myself for what I did. I don't think I know how, honestly. I think that's something I need to figure out before I write you another one of these. Maybe this is the last one. Maybe it isn't. I never seem to know until I'm sitting here with the pen in my hand." David sat with that letter for a long time, the final one, dated months before Victoria had ever sent that first message. He thought about all the unspoken parallel grief that had existed in this town without either of them knowing. Claire writing letters that would never be sent. David building a life designed to outrun a guilt that wasn't entirely his. Both of them circling the same wound from opposite directions, never once colliding until an old woman decided she was tired of watching it happen. He spent the next few days mostly with Eli. Back to the beach, a trip to a small aquarium 2 towns over that thrilled his son to the point of incoherence. Slow mornings on the porch with coffee and cartoons. He felt lighter in a way that surprised him. The guilt he'd carried for 6 years no longer sitting in his chest like a verdict, replaced by something that still ached, but ached the way a healing wound aches, not an open one. Claire called on the 4th day, her voice steadier than it had been at the pier. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said, about setting the guilt down instead of forgetting it. And I think I want to try that too." A pause. "I talked to my therapist about everything. She thinks I've spent 6 years punishing myself in slow motion. Work, mostly, since that's the only thing I let myself fully invest in. She thinks it's time I stopped." "That sounds like good advice," David said. "It is. I hate that it took someone I pay $200 an hour to tell me something my own mother apparently figured out on her own, sitting alone in that house with a box of my secrets." David laughed. "Victoria's full of surprises lately." "She is," Claire agreed, something warm in her voice now. "I'm still a little angry with her, for the record, for keeping the letters, for not telling me before she gave them to you. I told her that. She accepted it without arguing, which honestly is the most un-Victoria thing I've ever seen her do." "She seemed determined not to repeat old patterns," David said, "whatever that costs her." "I think you're right." Claire was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to see you again before you leave. Properly, I mean. Maybe with Eli, if that's not too strange." David felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been held tight for longer than just this last week. "I'd like that. He'd probably want to tell you everything he's learned about sharks." "I look forward to the lecture," Claire said, and David could hear, unmistakably this time, the smile in her voice. They made plans for 2 days later. A simple afternoon at the beach. Nothing weighted with expectation. Just 3 people, however briefly connected, spending time in the same place without the past pressing quite so hard against the present. David hung up the phone and sat for a long moment on the porch, watching Eli build something elaborate and doomed out of sticks in the front yard, and felt for the first time since he'd driven into Millhaven like the ground beneath him had stopped shifting and settled into something he could actually stand on. He thought about the man who'd parked outside Sal's diner just over a week ago, unable to make his hands move toward the ignition, carrying a guilt he'd mistaken for the whole truth. That man felt distant now. Not gone exactly, but smaller somehow, less central to the story than he'd been for 6 long years. Tomorrow there would be more conversations, more careful steps toward whatever this was becoming, more time required before anyone could say with certainty what came next. But tonight, sitting on a sagging porch, with the ocean breathing somewhere in the dark, and his son building something out of sticks that would inevitably fall apart and get built again tomorrow, David Carter felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could properly measure. He felt like a man who was finally putting something down that he'd been carrying for far too long. The morning of the beach meeting, David woke up before Eli for once, lying in the half-dark listening to the house settle around him, and found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, taking inventory of his own life without flinching from it. He thought about Richmond, the apartment that had never quite felt lived in, the job that paid well and meant little, the careful, controlled distance he'd kept from everyone who tried to get close since the divorce. He thought about how much of that distance had been architecture built on a single false belief, that he was a man who broke things simply by being himself, and the safest thing he could do for anyone he loved was leave before that became undeniable. He didn't believe that anymore. Not fully. Maybe not even mostly. It would take longer than a week and a box of letters to dismantle 6 years of a story he'd repeated to himself so often it had calcified into identity. But the foundation had cracked, and David understood enough about himself now to know that once a foundation cracked, you couldn't just paper over it and pretend the structure was sound. You had to actually go in and rebuild. Eli wandered into the kitchen around 8, hair sticking up in 3 directions, already talking about whether Claire would want to see the shell collection he'd been curating all week. I think she'd love that, David said, pouring cereal he definitely should have bought in a smaller box, given how much of it ended up on the floor. Just remember she might not know as much about sharks as you do. Go easy on her. I'll start with the basics, Eli said solemnly, like he was preparing a briefing. They met Claire at the same stretch of beach David and Eli had been visiting all week, a quieter section away from the pier where the sand was softer and the crowds thinner. She was already there when they arrived, sitting on a blanket in jeans rolled to her knees, watching the water, and something about the picture of her there, ordinary, unguarded, waiting for them, hit David harder than he expected. "Hi," Eli said immediately, dropping to his knees beside her blanket without any of the social hesitation adults burden themselves with. "I brought my shells. This one's my favorite. It's a whelk. Joan looked it up for me." "It's beautiful," Claire said, turning the shell over in her hands with genuine attention, the kind adults usually only fake for children but rarely actually feel. "Did you find this one yourself?" "Yeah, Dad almost stepped on it, but I yelled and he stopped." "Quick reflexes," Claire said, glancing up at David with the first easy smile he'd seen from her since he'd arrived in town. "Years of practice," David said, sitting down on the blanket beside them. "He's been training me all week." They spent the next hour exactly the way David had hoped they would, without weight, without the gravity of 6 years of unfinished business pressing down on every sentence. Eli delivered his shark lecture in full, complete with hand gestures David recognized from a nature documentary they'd watched together months ago. Claire asked good questions, the kind that suggested she was actually listening rather than performing patience, and at one point Eli decided, unprompted, that she should be allowed to hold his favorite shell for safekeeping, which David understood, watching his son's face, to be about as serious an honor as a 6-year-old could bestow. Later, while Eli built something elaborate near the waterline with a bucket and a stick he'd declared to be his tool, David and Claire sat together on the blanket, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, watching him work. "He's wonderful," Claire said quietly. "You should be proud." "I am," David said. "Most days I feel like I'm just barely keeping up with him. But yeah, he's the best thing I've done." Claire was quiet for a moment, watching Eli drag his bucket back and forth from the water to his growing structure. "Can I tell you something I've been thinking about all week?" "Of course." "I used to think love was supposed to be easy if it was real," she said. "That if two people truly loved each other, it would just work naturally, without all the mess. I think that's actually a really dangerous thing to believe, looking back. Because the second things got hard between us, I didn't think, this is normal, we just need to work through it. I thought, this is proof it was never real to begin with. And I think that belief did more damage than anything you or I actually did wrong." David turned that over, recognizing the shape of it, because he'd been circling something similar all week. "I think I believe something close to the opposite," he said. "I thought if love was real, it should be effortless for me to be good at it, patient, present, all the things I watched other people seem to do naturally. And every time I struggled with it, every time I got tired or scared or said the wrong thing, I took that as proof I just wasn't built for it, like there was some gene other people had that I was missing." "Neither of those beliefs is true," Claire said. "No," David agreed. "I don't think either of them is true. I think real love is just two people fumbling through something difficult, over and over, and choosing to keep showing up anyway. Nobody's actually good at it. I think the people who look good at it from the outside have just gotten better at fumbling without giving up." Claire smiled, a small, tired, genuine thing. "My therapist would probably frame that more clinically. But yeah, that's basically it." They sat there for a while longer, the ocean rolling in steady and unhurried beside them, Eli's voice occasionally rising in some narrated drama about his bucket fortress, and David felt something settle between them that hadn't been there even at the pier 2 nights before. Not resolution exactly, but a kind of ease, the comfortable quiet of two people who'd finally stopped performing for each other. "I have to go back to Richmond soon," David said eventually. "I've got Eli's school starting back up in a couple weeks, and work's been patient, but not infinitely patient." Claire nodded slowly, watching the water. "I figured. I wasn't going to ask, but I figured. I don't want this whatever this is, whatever we're rebuilding, I don't want it to just end because of geography," David said. but I also don't want to make promises right now that I'm not sure either of us is ready to keep. I think we both have a habit of moving too fast when guilt finally lifts, and I don't want to repeat old mistakes just wearing new clothes." "That's fair," Claire said. "I think I'd actually be more worried if you suggested something dramatic right now. Moving in together, some grand declaration, all of that. It would feel like we were trying to skip the part where we actually learn how to do this differently. So what do we do instead?" Claire considered the question seriously, watching Eli stack wet sand with theatrical focus. "I think we talk. Actually talk this time. Instead of writing letters we never send or building walls because we're scared of being a burden. I think you go back to Richmond and I keep doing what I'm doing here, and we see each other when we can, and we say the true thing instead of the easy thing, even when it's uncomfortable. We already know what happens when we don't do that." "I can do that," David said. "I want to do that." "Me too," Claire said, and there was something in her voice, not certainty exactly, but a kind of careful hope, the sound of someone choosing to believe in something despite every reason her past had given her not to. What's up? David stayed in Mill Haven 4 more days after that. He saw Claire twice more, both times simple, unhurried. Dinner one evening at a place away from the pier. A walk along the boardwalk another afternoon while Eli was with Joan, getting ice cream and talking about things that had nothing to do with the past at all. Just 2 adults discovering, slowly, who the other person had become in 6 years apart. There was no rush in any of it, no grasping toward some finish line. It felt, David thought, like exactly what it should have felt like the first time around, if either of them had known then what they understood now. He went back to see Victoria one more time before he left, alone this time, without Eli. She met him at the door looking older somehow than she had that first afternoon. Though David understood now it wasn't age so much as the particular exhaustion of having finally set down something heavy she'd been carrying for years. "I wanted to thank you properly," David said, standing in the same living room where his entire understanding of himself had started coming apart, "before I head back to Richmond." "You don't owe me thanks," Victoria said, though David could see it landed somewhere real in her. "I did something selfish, in its own way. I couldn't carry the weight of that silence any longer. You happened to be the one who needed the truth I was finally ready to give." "Selfish or not, it changed everything," David said. "I came here thinking I knew exactly what kind of man I was. Turns out I didn't know half of it." Victoria studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes. "Can I tell you something, David? Something I've thought about a great deal this past week." "Of course." "My husband and I were married 31 years, she said, settling into a chair near the window, her gaze drifting toward the ocean. 31 years, and we spent most of them not saying the things that actually mattered. We'd argue about small things, money, schedules, whose turn it was to host the holidays, because small things were safe. You could fight about small things and still go to bed in the same house, still wake up married the next morning. But the big things, the real things, we let those sit in silence for decades. By the time he was dying, we'd built an entire marriage out of avoidance, and all that was left, at the very end, was 2 weeks to try to say everything we should have said across 31 years. Her voice caught slightly, the only crack David had seen in her composure since the day she'd opened that wooden chest. I watched my daughter inherit that same instinct. I watched you, a young man who clearly loved her, get caught in the wreckage of a pattern that had nothing to do with you originally, but that you absorbed anyway, the way people absorb the patterns of the families they marry into. I couldn't fix what happened with my husband. It was too late for that. But I could stop pretending I hadn't seen what was happening with you and Claire, and I could do something about it, even years too late. David sat with that for a long moment. The weight of what she was telling him settling into something he understood now applied far beyond his own situation. I think that's the thing nobody tells you when you're young, he said slowly, that the patterns you grow up around become the patterns you live inside, even when you swear you'll do it differently. I think Claire and I were both just repeating things we learned without ever choosing to learn them. Exactly, Victoria said. Which is why I think what you two are doing now, slow, careful, actually talking instead of performing silence, matters more than either of you probably realizes. You're not just fixing what happened 6 years ago. You're breaking something that's been passed down a lot longer than that. David thought about Eli then. about the patterns his own son was absorbing simply by watching how his father moved through the world, the way David handled disappointment, the way he talked about his own mistakes, whether he modeled honesty or avoidance when things got hard. It struck him, sitting in that living room with the ocean light fading outside the windows, that this entire ordeal wasn't only about reclaiming his own understanding of the past. It was about what kind of foundation he was building for his son to inherit, whether he wanted to or not. "Thank you," David said again, because it felt insufficient, but it was also the truest thing he had. For everything, for the letters, for the courage it took to give them to me, for not letting silence win one more time. Victoria reached out and took his hand briefly, her grip steady despite everything. "Take care of that boy, David, and take care of my daughter, if she'll let you. She deserves someone who finally understands that love isn't a test you pass by being perfect. It's a test you pass by staying even when you're not." David left the Hale house that evening with something settled in his chest that hadn't been there in 6 years. Not peace, exactly. Not yet, but the beginning of it. The first real foundation for it. No. The night before David and Eli were set to drive back to Richmond, he sat down at the small desk in the rental house and wrote a letter of his own. Not to send anywhere, not to anyone in particular at first. He simply needed to put something down on paper the way Claire had needed to, all those years. A way of making sense of something too large to hold only in his head. I used to think the worst thing a person could do was fail someone they loved. I spent 6 years believing I'd done exactly that I'd failed Claire so completely there was nothing left to do but disappear and try to become someone better somewhere else, someone who couldn't hurt her anymore because he wasn't around to do it. What I understand now is that failing someone isn't actually the worst thing. The worst thing is failing them and then refusing to ever look at it honestly, burying it under guilt instead of understanding, letting shame stand in for the harder work of actually learning what went wrong. I did that for 6 years. I let guilt do the job that honesty should have done, and guilt is a cheap substitute. It feels like accountability, but it doesn't actually teach you anything. It just makes you smaller. Claire and I didn't fall apart because either of us was unworthy of love. We fell apart because we were both so afraid of losing each other that we sabotaged the very thing we were trying to protect. I left because I believed leaving first was more honest than waiting to be left. She went quiet because she believed silence was safer than admitting how much she needed me. Neither of us was right. Neither of us was the villain. We were just two people who'd never been taught how to stay through the hard parts, doing the only thing we knew how to do when things got difficult, running in our own separate directions toward the exits we'd already built for ourselves before we ever needed them. I think about Eli a lot writing this. I think about what he's learning just by watching me, whether I show him a father who runs from hard things or one who stays and works through them, clumsily, imperfectly, but actually present. I don't want him inheriting the same fear I carried. I want him to know that love isn't supposed to be effortless. It's supposed to be worked at, stumbled through, repaired when it breaks, not abandoned the first time it gets difficult. I don't know exactly what happens next with Claire. I don't think either of us knows yet, and for the first time in 6 years, that uncertainty doesn't terrify me the way it used to. I think I finally understand that not knowing the ending isn't the same as being doomed to fail. Sometimes it just means you're finally brave enough to find out. He folded the letter and put it in his bag, not sure yet what he'd do with it. Maybe nothing. Maybe just keep it as a private marker of where his head had been on this particular night, in this particular town, at the end of this particular chapter. Some things, he was learning, didn't need an audience to matter. Some truths just needed to exist, written down somewhere, real. The morning they left, David and Eli stopped by the Hale house one more time. Claire was there, along with Victoria, both of them standing on the porch when David pulled into the driveway. And something about the sight of them together, mother and daughter, finally honest with each other after years of careful distance, struck David as its own small miracle, separate from whatever was happening between him and Claire. "You're really going," Claire said, walking down to meet him at the car while Eli ran ahead to say goodbye to Marisol, who'd apparently become something of a favorite over the course of the week. "Got to," David said. "School, work, the usual gravity of real life." "I know." Claire wrapped her arms around herself against the morning chill, the same gesture David had seen her do a dozen times now, though it no longer read to him as guarded the way it had that first night. Now it just looked like a habit, like something she did when she was thinking carefully about what to say next. I meant what I said, about talking, about doing this differently. Me too, David said. I'll call you tonight once we're settled back home, and I want you to know whatever pace this needs to move at, I'm not in a hurry. I spent 6 years rushing toward conclusions about things I didn't actually understand. I'd rather get this right slowly than get it wrong fast. Claire smiled, something soft and real in it. That might be the most grown-up thing I've ever heard you say. 6 years and a box of letters, David said. Apparently that's what it takes. They stood there for a moment, the morning light catching the water beyond the house, and then Claire stepped forward and hugged him. Not the careful, formal embrace of two people testing boundaries, but something fuller, something that held 6 years of complicated grief and the fragile beginning of something new all at once. Drive safe, she said, pulling back. Call me when you're home. I will. Victoria came down to say her own goodbye, and when she reached David, she held his hand in both of hers for a long moment, her eyes bright in a way David hadn't seen from her before. Thank you for trusting me with the truth, David said, even when it would have been so much easier not to. Easier isn't always better, Victoria said. I learned that lesson far too late in my own life. I'm glad you two got to learn it while there was still time to do something with it. Eli came running back from his goodbyes with Marisol, climbed into the car without prompting, already chattering about something he'd seen in the kitchen, and David got behind the wheel, rolling down the window one more time as Claire and Victoria stood together on the porch, watching them go. Bye, Claire. Bye, Victoria. Eli yelled out the window, waving with the unself-conscious enthusiasm only children manage. I'll bring more shells next time. I'll hold you to that, Claire called back, laughing, and the sound of it followed David out of the driveway and down the coastal road, lighter than anything he'd carried in 6 years. Before they left town for good, David pulled the car over at a stretch of public beach near the edge of Millhaven, the same gray Atlantic visible through a gap in the dunes that had greeted him the first morning he arrived. He hadn't planned the stop. It simply felt necessary, a final piece of something he needed to do before he let the town slip into the rearview mirror. One more beach? Eli asked, already unbuckling himself before David had fully parked. One more beach, David confirmed. They walked down through the dune grass together, David's hand wrapped around his son's smaller one, the wind coming hard off the water the way it always did this time of year, carrying salt and the particular cold clarity of a coastline that didn't care about anyone's timeline but its own. The waves rolled in steady, unhurried, the same way they had every single day David had been gone. Every single day he'd spent in Richmond convinced he was the sole architect of his own ruin. Every single night Claire had sat at her kitchen table writing letters into a silence that never answered back. The ocean didn't know about any of that. It just kept moving, forward and back, patient in a way human beings rarely manage to be with each other. Dad, Eli said, looking up at him, sand already working its way into his shoes despite David's best efforts. Are you happy now? David considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about the man who'd parked outside Sal's diner a little over a week ago, unable to make himself turn the ignition off, carrying a story about himself that had calcified into something he mistook for fact. He thought about the chest of letters, about Claire's wet eyes in her mother's doorway, about Victoria's hand steady around his, about the slow unraveling of 6 years of guilt into something he could finally actually set down. Yeah, David said, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he meant it completely. I think I am, Bud. Happier than I've been in a long time. Because of the letters? Partly because of the letters. David crouched down to Eli's level, the way he did when he wanted his son to know a conversation actually mattered. You know how sometimes you build something on the beach, and it falls down, and you think it's because you did something wrong? Eli nodded solemnly, clearly recalling several recent structural failures. Sometimes things fall down because of more than one reason, David said. Sometimes the wind helps knock it over too, or the tide came in faster than you expected, or somebody else stepped too close without meaning to. It's not always just one person's fault when something breaks. Understanding that, really understanding it, not just saying the words, that's what made me happier. Eli took this in with the focused attention he gave most abstract things adults tried to explain to him, processing it through whatever 6-year-old logic made the world manageable. So it's not bad that things fall down sometimes? No, David said, something catching in his throat as he said it, surprised by how much the simple exchange was landing somewhere deep and unexpected. It's not bad. What matters is whether you try to build it again, and whether you're honest about what actually knocked it down in the first place, instead of just blaming yourself for everything. Eli seemed satisfied with this, in the easy way children accept truths that adults spend years struggling to actually believe, and went running off toward the waterline to test some theory about how far he could get his feet wet before the cold became unbearable. David watched him go, watched the small, determined shape of his son against the vast gray water, and felt something settle into place that he understood. Finally, he would carry with him long after Millhaven disappeared behind them on the highway. He thought about all the years he'd spent believing that the measure of a man was how well he avoided ever breaking anything, how careful, how controlled, how perfectly he could manage his own heart so nothing ever shattered under his watch. He understood now that this had been the wrong measure entirely. The real measure wasn't whether things broke. Things always broke. Eventually, no matter how careful you were, because two imperfect people trying to build something together were always going to hit storms neither of them saw coming. The real measure was what you did after, whether you ran from the wreckage and built a story where you alone were responsible, or whether you stayed close enough to the truth to eventually understand it properly. Messy and shared and far more human than the simple, punishing version he'd been telling himself. Claire had taught him that in her own way without ever meaning to, through years of letters she never intended anyone to read. Victoria had taught him that too, finally choosing honesty over 31 years of inherited silence, deciding late in her life that comfort wasn't worth more than truth. And somewhere in all of it, David understood he was teaching it now to his own son, simply by being a man who'd finally learned to stop carrying guilt that wasn't his alone, and start carrying instead the harder, more honest weight of understanding. He stood at the edge of the water for a long while, watching Eli chase the tide out and run from it coming back. The same game his son had been playing all week. The same game, David thought, that everyone eventually played with their own past. Running toward it, retreating from it, learning slowly how close you could get before it actually hurt, and discovering eventually that the water wasn't trying to drown you at all. It was just doing what water always did, indifferent and patient, rewriting the shoreline a little more every single day, taking nothing personally, asking nothing of anyone except that they keep showing up to meet it. That, David thought, was as close to a lesson as he expected to get out of any of this. Closure wasn't always a conversation you got to have on your own timeline, wrapped up neatly with an apology and a clean ending. Sometimes it was a gift somebody else decided to give you, years later than either of you wanted, delivered by a brave, tired woman who'd spent too long watching good people suffer over a story that was never entirely true. Sometimes the truth arrived exactly when you'd stopped expecting it, in a box of paper and ink that had been waiting in the dark for someone brave enough to finally open it. He thought about all the people out there carrying some version of the same weight he'd carried, believing they alone had ruined something, replaying the same argument at 3 a.m. and always arriving at the same guilty verdict, never considering that the other person in that memory might be doing the exact same thing in some other house, on some other coastline, equally convinced they alone were to blame. He thought that if there was anything worth taking from all of this, it was that the understanding that very few things break because of just one person. Most wounds have two hands on them, even when only one person is left holding the evidence. "Dad, come look!" Eli's voice carried back to him on the wind, and David walked down to where his son was crouched over something half buried in wet sand, some new treasure for the collection that had taken over the entire back seat of the car. David crouched beside him, looked at whatever small, ordinary miracle his son had found, and let himself simply be there, present, unguarded, a man who'd finally stopped running from his own story long enough to actually understand it. They stayed another 20 minutes, until the cold finally won, and Eli's teeth started chattering despite his determined protests that he was fine. And then they walked back up through the dune grass together, sand in their shoes, salt on their skin, and got into the car for the long drive home. David's phone buzzed once as he pulled back onto the highway, Eli already half asleep in the back seat despite his best efforts to stay awake and narrate the passing scenery. A text from Claire, "Drive safe." Call me tonight. And David, thank you for coming back, even though I know it would have been easier not to. David smiled, set the phone down, and watched the gray stretch of Millhaven shrink in his rearview mirror, the ocean disappearing behind the dunes one last time before the highway curved inland. He didn't know exactly what came next. Not with Claire, not with the slow, careful thing they were building from 6 years of wreckage and honesty finally given room to breathe. He didn't know if it would work, in the end, or if some new difficulty would eventually test them again, the way difficulty always tested everyone who tried to hold on to something fragile and real. But for the first time in longer than he could properly remember, the not knowing didn't frighten him. It just felt like the next honest chapter of a story he was finally brave enough to keep writing instead of running from. The road stretched out ahead of him, long and ordinary, carrying him back toward the rest of his life. A life that no longer needed to be built on the foundation of a guilt that was never fully his, but on something steadier now, something closer to the truth. Beside him, in the rearview mirror, his son slept peacefully, sand still caught in the creases of his small shoes, completely unaware that somewhere behind them, in a quiet coastal town he'd probably visit again one day, his father had finally learned the difference between running from your past and actually making peace with it. David Carter drove north with the windows cracked and the radio low. No longer the man who'd arrived in Millhaven carrying 6 years of silent blame, but someone lighter, someone clearer, someone finally able to look back at everything that had happened and see it for what it actually was. Not a single failure, not one man's ruin, but two imperfect people who had loved each other as well as they knew how, broken under the weight of fears neither of them understood yet, and were now, slowly, separately, and maybe even together, learning how to build something better out of the wreckage. The waves kept rolling behind him, patient as ever, rewriting the shoreline they left behind, the way they always had and always would, indifferent to everything human beings carried, and willing, every single day, to wash it gently back out to sea. 3 weeks back in Richmond, and David's apartment looked different to him, though nothing in it had actually changed. Same couch, same secondhand bookshelf, same framed photo of Eli's first day of kindergarten propped on the kitchen counter. What had changed was the man walking through the rooms. He noticed himself noticing things. The silence that used to feel like relief now occasionally felt like absence. The late nights at the office that used to feel like virtue now sometimes felt like another kind of running, just dressed up in a tie. He called Claire most evenings, after Eli was asleep, the two of them talking for an hour sometimes only 20 minutes, depending on the day either of them had. There was no script to it. Some nights they talked about nothing important. A contract dispute on her end, a stubborn printer jam on his, the particular indignity of grocery shopping with a 6-year-old who suddenly only ate orange foods. Other nights the conversation drifted somewhere heavier, and David found himself saying things out loud he'd never said to anyone, not even his ex-wife during 3 years of marriage, not even Mara, who knew almost everything about him. "I think I was scared of being ordinary," he told Claire one night, lying on his couch with the lights off, the city humming faintly outside his window. "With you, back then. I thought if I worked enough, achieved enough, I could make myself into someone worth keeping. I never let myself just be a regular guy who loved you. I was always performing some better version, exhausting myself trying to be impressive instead of just being present." "I did something similar," Claire admitted. "I performed competence. Like if I never let you see me struggle, you'd never realize I needed you as much as I did. I thought needing someone made you breakable." "We were both so busy hiding," David said, "that we missed actually seeing each other." "We're not hiding now," Claire said, and there was something steady in her voice that hadn't been there even at the pier. "No," David agreed. "We're really not." It wasn't always easy. There were nights David hung up the phone frustrated, feeling like the distance between Richmond and Millhaven was doing exactly what distance always did, slowly turning a living thing into a long-distance idea of a thing. There was a week in late September when Claire got swallowed by a crisis at the company, a shipping contract gone wrong, and her calls grew shorter, more distracted, and David felt the old fear rear up, that he wasn't enough of a priority, that this was how it always started, the quiet pulling away that ended in someone disappearing for good. He almost let the fear win. He almost retreated into the silence that used to be his default setting. Instead, he called her directly during a lunch break, instead of waiting for the evening call that might or might not come. "Hey," he said, when she picked up, her voice clipped, clearly mid-crisis. "I'm not calling to add to your stress. I just wanted to say, I noticed you've seemed distant this week, and the old me would have assumed that meant something bad and gone quiet about it. I'm telling you instead. That's all. No expectations. I just didn't want to do the silent thing again." There was a pause on the line, and then Claire let out a breath that sounded like relief. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "I've been buried, David, and I think some part of me has been bracing for you to give up on me because of it. Old habit. I appreciate you not doing the thing where you just disappear and let me guess why." "We said we'd do this differently," David said. "Doesn't mean it's easy. Just means we keep choosing it, even on the hard days." That conversation, small as it was, did more for David's confidence in what they were building than almost anything else that had happened since Millhaven. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was just two people choosing honesty over the comfortable, familiar exit, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. Eli started asking about Claire more often as the weeks went on. In the unselfconscious way children ask about things, adults are still trying to figure out themselves. "When do we go back to the Shark Beach?" he asked one Saturday morning, halfway through a bowl of cereal, his tone suggesting this was a matter of considerable urgency. "Maybe Thanksgiving," David said. "We'll see how everyone's schedules look." "Is Claire your girlfriend now?" David nearly choked on his coffee. "What makes you ask that?" "You smile different when you talk to her on the phone," Eli said, with the devastating directness only small children seemed capable of. "Mom smiles different too when she talks to her work friend Daniel. I think that's what it means." David considered how much honesty a 6-year-old actually needed and decided, in keeping with everything he'd relearned this past month, that the truth, simplified appropriately, was still better than a dodge. "I think Claire and I are figuring out what we are," he said carefully. "We used to know each other a long time ago, before you were born. We're becoming friends again, and maybe something more than that eventually. I don't want to make promises about it yet because I want to make sure whatever we build is solid before I tell you it's a sure thing. Does that make sense?" Eli thought about this with his usual gravity. "Is it like building a sandcastle? You don't tell people it's finished until it actually holds together?" David laughed, struck again by how often his son's simple logic landed exactly on the truth adults spent years dressing up in complicated language. "Exactly like that, bud." "Okay," Eli said, apparently satisfied, and returned to his cereal as though the matter were now fully resolved. Thanksgiving came, and with it, the trip back to Millhaven that David had quietly been looking forward to since the morning he'd driven away with the ocean shrinking in his rearview mirror. They stayed at Victoria's house this time. In a guest room, Victoria insisted on preparing herself, despite having a staff who could have done it twice as well. Claire met them at the door, and the embrace she gave David lasted a beat longer than the one in the driveway months earlier, something settled and certain in it now that hadn't fully existed before. Dinner that evening was the kind of meal David hadn't experienced in years. Not performative, not careful, just 4 people, including Eli, sitting around a table telling stories and laughing more than the topic strictly warranted. Victoria, David noticed, looked lighter than he'd ever seen her. The careful armor she'd worn that first afternoon almost entirely gone now, replaced by an ease that suggested honesty really had been worth whatever it cost her. "I want to say something," Victoria announced partway through dessert, tapping her wine glass lightly, drawing everyone's attention with the easy authority of a woman accustomed to commanding rooms. "I spent 31 years married to a man I loved, and most of that marriage was conducted in a kind of polite silence neither of us ever found the courage to break. I watched my daughter inherit that same silence, and I watched a good man nearly disappear under the weight of a guilt that was never fully his. I don't say any of this to dampen a holiday dinner. I say it because I think gratitude only means something when you understand exactly what you're grateful for." She looked at David, then at Claire, something fierce and tender moving across her face all at once. "I'm grateful, every single day, that I found the courage to open that chest before it was too late for either of you to do something with what was inside it." "To courage, then," David said, raising his glass, "even when it shows up years late." "Especially then," Victoria said, and they all drank to it, Eli included, with his cup of apple cider held just as high as everyone else's,
completely unaware of how much weight the toast was actually carrying, simply happy to be included.
Later that night, after Eli had fallen asleep in the guest room and Victoria had retired upstairs, David and Claire sat together on the back porch, wrapped in blankets against the November chill, the ocean a dark, steady presence beyond the dunes. "I've been thinking about something," Claire said, watching the water. "About what you said back in the summer, about how guilt isn't punishment you deserve, it's just something you eventually have to set down. What about it? I think I'm finally starting to actually believe it. Not just understand it in my head, believe it, in my chest, the way you said it takes longer to do." She turned to look at him, the porch light catching the side of her face. "I used to think the letters were proof of how much I failed you. Now I think they were proof of how much I loved you, even when I didn't know how to say it the right way." But David reached over and took her hand, the gesture simple, unhurried, nothing performed about it. "I think that's exactly what they were." "Where does this go, David?" Claire asked, her voice quieter now, more vulnerable than he'd heard it since that first night in her mother's living room. "I'm not asking for promises. I want to know what you're hoping for, even if it's not certain yet." David thought about the question seriously, the way he'd learned to think about most things now, slowly, without rushing toward an answer, just to fill the silence. "I'm hoping we keep doing exactly what we've been doing," he said, "showing up honestly, even when it's inconvenient, calling instead of going quiet, letting Eli get to know you properly, at whatever pace feels right for him. I'm hoping, eventually, distance stops being the obstacle it is right now. Maybe I look for work closer to here. Maybe you expand the company's reach toward Richmond. I don't know exactly how it resolves logistically. But I know I don't want to lose this again because we were too scared to keep choosing it on the hard days." "That sounds like enough," Claire said softly. "More than enough, actually." They sat together for a long while after that, not talking, just present, the ocean rolling steadily beyond the dark dunes, indifferent and patient the way it always had been, the way it would keep being long after every person sitting on that porch had lived out whatever story they were currently building. Spring came eventually, the way it always does, indifferent to how slowly or quickly human beings manage to heal. David had, by then, taken a position with a firm that operated out of both Richmond and a satellite office 2 hours from Mill Haven, close enough that the drive became something he did most weekends, instead of a journey requiring careful planning. Eli had a calendar in his room with stickers marking the days until they saw Claire next, a system Joan had apparently taught him during one of their long afternoons together, and which Eli guarded with the seriousness of an air traffic controller. On a Saturday in April, David stood again at the same stretch of beach where he'd had that conversation with his son the morning they left Millhaven for the first time. The one about sandcastles and blame and things falling down for more than one reason. Claire stood beside him this time, her hand in his, Eli running ahead toward the waterline with a bucket that had survived, somehow, an entire winter in the trunk of David's car. "You ever think about how close we came to never having any of this?" Claire asked, watching her. Watching Eli, David noted, the possessive pronoun forming naturally in his own head before he caught it, surprised by how quickly that had happened. "If my mother had decided to stay quiet a little longer, if you'd never picked up the phone." "I think about it sometimes," David admitted. "Mostly, I try not to dwell on it. I think the better use of that thought is just being grateful it didn't go that way, instead of imagining the version where it did." "That's very evolved of you," Claire said, smiling. 6 years and a box of letters," David said, the line worn comfortable now from repetition, a private joke that had become something closer to a shared truth. Apparently that's what it takes to teach a man something his 25-year-old self refused to learn. They watched Eli for a while, his small, determined shape against the wide gray water, building something that would inevitably collapse and get rebuilt within the hour, the same as it always did, the same as everything human beings tried to construct against the patient, indifferent pull of the tide. David thought, watching his son work, about everything the past year had taught him. That guilt and responsibility were not the same thing, that silence was rarely the safe choice it pretended to be, that two people could love each other completely and still break something together simply because nobody had ever taught them how to hold on properly. He thought about Victoria, finally choosing honesty after 31 years of practiced avoidance, understanding too late with her husband but not too late with her daughter and the stranger her daughter had once loved. He thought about all the people out there right now, carrying some version of the story he used to carry, convinced they alone had ruined something beautiful, never imagining that somewhere else, someone they loved was carrying the exact same conviction, equally wrong, equally alone in it. If there was a lesson in any of it, David thought, it wasn't really about romance at all, not at its core. It was about the particular danger of incomplete stories. The way human beings, faced with pain, often reach for the simplest possible explanation, the one that requires the least complexity to carry, even when that explanation is a lie. The truth was almost always messier than the story you told yourself in the dark. The truth required two people to admit two separate failures, intertwined, neither one canceling out the other. Both of them simply human, both of them just trying to survive a fear they'd never been taught to name. "What are you thinking about?" Claire asked, watching his face. "Just how grateful I am," David said, "that your mother decided telling the truth, even years too late, mattered more than staying comfortable." Claire squeezed his hand. "Me too." Eli came running back up the beach, soaked to the knees despite explicit instructions not to go past his ankles, holding something triumphantly above his head. "Look what I found," he announced, breathless. "It's a whole sand dollar, not even broken." He held it out for inspection, and Claire took it carefully, turning it over with the same genuine attention she'd given his shells the first day they'd properly met. And something about the simple continuity of that gesture, the same care, months apart, a relationship built slowly out of 100 small moments just like this one, settled into David's chest like something finally, permanently, at peace. "That's a really good find," Claire said. "You should keep that one safe." "I'm going to put it with the others," Eli said. "I'm building a whole collection. Dad says when I have enough I can make a display." "I'd love to see it sometime," Claire said, and Eli, beaming at the attention, ran back toward the water for more treasure, the bucket swinging from his hand. David watched them both. His son's careful joy, Claire's unguarded warmth as she watched him go. And understood, standing there with the wind coming hard off the water, that he was no longer the man who'd parked outside Sal's diner, unable to turn off the ignition, carrying a story he'd mistaken for fact. That man had needed 6 years and a box of unsent letters to finally understand the difference between guilt and truth, between running and staying, between a wound you nurse forever and one you finally let yourself heal. The waves kept coming, steady and unhurried, the same way they always had, rewriting the shoreline a little more with every pass, indifferent to the human beings standing at the edge of them, working through their own slow, imperfect repairs. David thought that was probably the truest thing the ocean had ever taught him, that nothing stayed broken forever unless you refused to let it heal, and that closure, real closure, wasn't a single conversation or a single letter or even a single moment of forgiveness. It was 1,000 small choices afterward, made over and over, to keep showing up honestly instead of running toward the easier, lonelier exit. He reached for Claire's hand again, and together they walked down toward the water, toward their son, toward whatever came next. Not certain of every detail, not promised a future without its own difficulties, but finally, completely, no longer afraid of finding out,